Hello, everyone. It's time for another live stream. It's been a little while since I've done one of these, so I thought I have a bit of an opportunity now. So let's whip one out. So today I'm going to be covering a video just posted up by Sean McDowell covering materialism. So this one here, where's it gone? Why is it buffering like that?
Our guest today.
So I haven't watched this video. I've only looked at a few little bits of it. When I first saw the title about how materialism destroys American culture, I thought that the video must be talking about materialism in the sense of like consumerism, an obsession with material goods and wealth and appearance and things like that. And they may discuss that in the video, I'm not sure, but that's definitely not what the overall thrust of the video is about. It's actually about materialism as a philosophical position, the view that all that exists is the physical material world. I'll use physicalism and materialism interchangeably, by the way. And that is not only a view that I hold, but it's actually a view that I've been writing a book about for the past few years. And I've been making pretty good progress. Yeah. Yes, and as Digital Gnosis Nathan points out, welcome by the way, it was a bit surprising to me to hear that physical reductivism is forcing the US to destroy its economy with tariffs, among other issues. So anyway, I was quite interested to see how this all shakes out. So we're going to give this video a watch here. Before we start, I want to mention that before everyone asks, oh, where is James? Is it cold there? He's wearing a scarf. He's all rugged up. Yes, so I'm still in Australia, and it is indeed winter here. So although it's not especially cold at the moment, it doesn't get that cold here. It's cold enough to wear a scarf. So yes, I'm indeed not in the northern hemisphere. There is in fact a whole other side to the planet, and shockingly, the seasons aren't the same everywhere. Okay, so now that we've got that out of the way, because it seems that every time I just stream with a scarf on or a jumper or whatever in the northern hemisphere summer, that people sort of forget this fact. But anyway, let's get started on the video.
Has a provocative thesis about the reason for the tribalism in our politics, the lawlessness in our courts, and the crisis of meaning rampaging in our culture. As a lawyer, he's been involved in some high-profile cases over the past few decades, and even litigated one case all the way to the Supreme Court. Barry Arrington is the author of the new book, Unforgetting God, and he's here to talk about it. Barry, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Sean. It's quite an honor. Thank you.
So a mutual friend of ours, William Dembski, who's been a friend of mine for decades, we co-authored a book on intelligent design together.
So that's a pretty big promise, right? Like the answer for lawlessness in our courts and the loss of meaning. What are the other things that they said? Let's get this at the start, right? Lawlessness in courts.
Our guest today has a of meaning rampaging.
Crisis of meaning.
As a lawyer, he's been involved in the lawlessness in our courts.
Tribalism,
of meaning,
crisis of meaning, lawlessness.
As a lawyer, Arrington is the author of the new book.
So evidently, all of those things are explained by materialism. Well, let's see how that goes.
Friend of ours, William Dembski, who's been a friend of mine, and was like, this is really interesting.
And I will skip around when I'm a bit uninterested in what they're saying. So forgive me for doing that. Lots of certificates are on his wall behind him. Interesting.
I would love to have Barry on. So let me just jump right in. Before we get to the provocative thesis, kind of at the heart of your work, tell us about the case you litigated to SCOTUS, because I want people to understand your background and legal training that you bring to this discussion.
Okay, so in 2020, I had a church come to me, and they had been shut down by the state of Colorado. I mean, basically the COVID pandemic was in full force, and Colorado had passed these regulations shutting churches down. Now, initially, people were kind of, well, maybe we can give them the benefit of the doubt. This is a new thing that we're dealing with. But as time progressed, they opened up the stores, and they opened up the marijuana dispensaries, and they opened up this and that. But they kept the churches shut down, and so it's time to go to court. And in the spring of 2020, I filed a case in federal district court, promptly lost. The court denied my motion to overturn the Colorado regulations, keeping churches closed. I appealed to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, the next court below the Supreme Court, above the district court, lost there too. Because in the summer of 2020, I don't know if you remember this, Calvary Chapel of Dayton Valley and had come around, and we get the famous quote from Gorsuch saying, well, Caesar's palace is open, but Calvary Chapel's is closed. There's no world in which the First Amendment allows that to happen. Yet, nevertheless, in a
What is Caesar's palace? I don't know the details of this circumstance in the particular case that they're talking about, but it doesn't seem unreasonable to me that you would allow at least some stores to open, like depending on, I mean, there was this notion at the time of essential work, right? I mean, here in Melbourne, we had the longest lockdown in the world, and there were some businesses that were allowed to open and some that weren't, right, at different times. and that was at least nominally decided on the basis of their risk versus benefit. Like, obviously you need food and drugstores to be open for sort of obvious reasons. And I guess depending on your point of view, you might think that having a physical church building open is also sort of an essential service. It does seem like that's the sort of thing you can do remotely. But anyway, I don't really think we need to get into the details of what the ideal policy during COVID to prevent the spread of a new infectious, and at that time, disease that didn't have any vaccination available. Barry seems to be just sort of ignoring those points. We didn't get into the details of that here, but it's sort of, I mean, maybe he's just going to say, look, if you don't believe in God, then you don't think churches are important. Like, I guess there's there's some sort of truth to that. But like, even if you do, surely that there's this notion of, well, what is in the benefit of society for us to do at a given time, considering both the cost of freedom and to restricting people's ability to freely worship in the way that they would ideally want versus the impacts on public health. So hopefully we're going to have some sort of nuanced discussion about that and how it relates to the broader issue of materialism.
For a vote, it happened. And then Justice Ginsburg died. And while my case was pending and Justice Barrett was appointed, and through a series of events, we got to a place where, in a case out of New York, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn, they decided that case initially, where they forced New York to open up all of its churches. And a couple of weeks later, they granted cert in my case, and ultimately we were able to force the Colorado government to open up the churches in Colorado as well.
Well, I have a million questions for you, what it's like to argue or put a case before the Supreme Court, but that'll be a conversation for another time. This book, you're really trying to
So I don't know if that was actually relevant at all, but anyway, maybe it will come up later.
kind of diagnose what you think is at the root of tribalism, lawlessness, a lack of meaning. But it really is, to put your cards on the table, this is an apologetics book in which you're making the case for the Christian faith. So again, before we get to your thesis and let you lay out your case for it, I'm really curious, your personal journey to the Christian faith. Did reasoning and the kind of evidence in this book play a role in it?
So I grew up in a Christian household. I was blessed to have Christian parents who had me in the church early. And so I can't say that apologetics per se led me to faith in Christ, but I can tell you what it did do.
Oh, well, end of the video there, chaps. Well, at least we're being honest about the role of apologetics. We all know that it's a post hoc rationalization of views that are decided upon for non-rational reasons in the vast, vast majority of cases. But anyway, we already knew that.
The onslaught of materialism and the onslaught of Darwinism, washed over me as I made my way through the secular education system, especially in the university, especially in the law schools. My dad was like a rock that I could cling to as those waves washed over me. And one of the things that we talked about over and over again are these apologetic issues. And I would go and we'd talk it through, and I was able to, survive that onslaught against my faith, which so many students, as you well know, Sean, lose their faith in university. I was able to.
What does he mean exactly by onslaught against the faith? I don't know the conditions in the university that he went to, though that would have been a few decades ago. But even when I started, the first 2 years of university that I did, actually, that's not true. The first year and a bit of university that I did, I was still religious. And certainly I had the impression that people at the university didn't share my faith. It wasn't something that worldview wasn't obviously the framework in which most scholarship is conducted when understanding the world, and it's more relevant in some than others. But I didn't really feel attacked or an onslaught. Almost everything that's studied in the university has very little direct bearing on faith. And even if you study something like evolution, for example, I didn't really have a particular position on like creationism versus evolution. It's something that I hadn't thought that much about really before I left the faith. But many Mormons at least lean sort of creationist or have some sort of creationist tendencies, and I probably did as well. But, even if I studied something like that, I just was under the, approached it from the point of view as, well, this is what secular science has to say about the issue. It's still up to me what I believe. And I never really felt to the contrary. And really any subjects that I ever did at Melbourne University, and I did quite a lot over my years there. Now, that's not necessarily going to be the case at every university, right? But Melbourne is quite certainly by US standards, you'd say progressive city, and Melbourne University is a secular public university. So I wouldn't expect things to be dramatically different in his context. So, I can't say that he didn't experience an onslaught against his faith. I don't know what he studied and what the professors were like and so forth. But, one does wonder whether the impression that he got and his memories of it is more reflective of the ideology behind movies like God's Not Dead, right? Where you have this absurd scenario of the atheist professors like demanding that their students prove that God exists in class or something like this, which is just something that is so absurd. So I'm a bit skeptical about the way he's presenting the story here. Let me say that without obviously being able to. But the thing is, he's not really explaining it anyway, so we just have to take his word.
Use the apologetic.
It was an onslaught, as opposed to simply like maybe people don't actually, like everyone doesn't share his way of looking at things.
Answers to a lot of those questions that are available that just some students sadly are not able or don't.
Yeah, that's a good point, Nathan. So in that movie, actually, you find out near the end of the film, the professor wasn't really an atheist at all. He was just angry at God because his wife left him, and he lets Jesus back into his heart right at the end of the film, just before he dies. So yes, good clarification there.
Not inclined to take advantage of.
Okay, so quick question. I just did a video recently where I asked 100 apologists what they considered their best single argument for the existence of God. If they had to pick one, off the top of your head, if you had to pick one as a lawyer, which one would you pick?
Well, Sean, I cheated because I saw that video. I saw all the answers.
Okay,
and amongst the answers that were given, I think Doug Rotice's answer was the best, in my personal view, because he said there's no one answer. It's cumulative. And I think the best evidence.
This is like a Jordan Peterson answer. You just can't answer the question. Like, what's the best single answer? There isn't a best one because it's cumulative. What is stupid? Oh dear. So, like, this notion of the cumulative case, I think, is one of the biggest admissions of apologetics, right? Because if your answer to every question about the strength of arguments is to point to the cumulative case, that is, at least I think tacitly, an admission that individual arguments or individual evidences don't actually have any evidentiary weight when you put pressure on them. Because if they did, you could order them in precedence of their evidentiary weight and identify which had the greatest. Now, of course, people might disagree about that, but at least it wouldn't be that difficult to do in principle, right? The problem is that it's difficult to defend any actual argument when pressed on it. And so almost always, at least the more thoughtful apologists or defenders will revert to this idea of a cumulative case. Pretty much all of them do in various ways. And again, I think I see that as an admission that individual arguments don't really have any significant weight, and you can't defend them very well when pressed. And so you just sort of say or imply that kind of through this amorphous process that when combined together, they somehow have a greater weight than their individual components. And, there's something to be said about coherence of a worldview, but that's a little bit of a different issue here. But the point is that the arguments for the Christian worldview surely need to carry some weight in and of themselves, and not merely in virtue of being part of a cumulative case. And if that's true, then you should be able to say which of them you find individually most convincing. So I find this answer very suspect and also revealing at the same time. It's more like if I say all the arguments at once, I can't focus on the objections. Yeah, I mean, that's the other side to it, right? It's a way of avoiding objections by not being specific about which arguments you're actually defending it, and simultaneously sort of defending them all at once. Yes, this is a good way to put it. 0 plus 0 plus 0 equals 1. Yeah. Anyway.
For the existence of God is that there is so many different strands for the existence of God.
It's like, I think sometimes, when actors and actresses, they do publicity tours for movies, right? And they ask them about especially when it's part of a franchise, they'll ask them about the previous installments or the lore and characters and things like that. And there was, maybe someone will remember where this was from, but I'm pretty sure it was one of the Star Wars sequels. One of the actors was asked, or maybe it wasn't the sequels, maybe it was one of the TV shows. But anyway, one of the actors or actresses was asked which was their favorite Star Wars movie. And their reply was, all of them. Which any Star Wars fan will immediately know that no actual Star Wars fan will respond with all of them when asked what is their favorite movie. They will all have a specific movie to answer, because that's what a fan does, right? They have preferences and thoughts about specific things and will share them. So if you say all of them, it means you don't really know what you're talking about, or at least aren't willing to talk about it. So anyway, it reminds me of that. There's
a phrase in the law that we call the totality of the evidence. When you're presenting a case to a jury, you don't focus on just the evidence that supports you or just the evidence for the other side. You weave it all into one thematic thread, and you let the totality of the evidence, rather than one or two things, kind of tell a story. But to be fair, if I had to pick one thing that really speaks to me, it's like,
who's going to answer the question?
Why is there something rather than nothing?
Amazing.
And
All right, I love it.
That's the one that I always come back to.
All right.
So the strongest argument is not even an argument; it's a question. Like Cameron would have something to say about it, right? With that, right? Questions aren't arguments. So I guess the argument would be that theism I don't know, you could formulate it as a deductive or an abductive argument. I don't even know. I'm not even going to try to reconstruct it for him. That seems to be a pretty lame argument.
At some point, man, I have so many questions for you. I love to unpack, but let's start moving closer to your thesis in your book. Again, the title is provocatively called Unforgetting God. Now, you had a role in defending some of the families in the Columbine High School massacre. I remember this well, Barry. I was traveling with my father right out of college. I graduated in 98. I think this was 99 was when the massacre was. I saw the personal devastation that caused on his life. And he actually assigned me as his assistant. He said, I want you to read every reason why somebody says this happened. Is it video games? Is it the lack of a father? Is it bullying in school? So I spent hours and hours reading all this stuff, putting a report together for him. So when you talked about being involved in this and some of the motivation behind it, especially carefully researching Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the two murderers behind this, my ears perked up. So what was your role kind of in that case? And what do you think was the heart of the motivation that led him to the Columbine massacre?
It's a good question, Sean. And just a little bit of background. Several of the families whose children were killed that day approached our firm, and we, through a series of events, we wound up representing them. And as a result, I took a very deep dive into that incident. Hundreds of hours, thousands of pages of documents, videos, audio recording. Some of the stuff that you might not have had access to, because I was involved in the lawsuit, had access to. And after that extremely deep dive into Eric Harris's, and I focus on Eric Harris because anyone who knows anything about Columbine knows Eric was the leader, Klebold was the follower. He was the mastermind. He was the brains behind the project. And it turns out it's fairly simple what motivated Eric Harris. He was not insane. He was a psychopath, but he wasn't insane. He wasn't trying to avenge himself of bullying. He was basically acting upon principles that he had.
So I don't know very much about this specific case. I don't feel inclined to do a deep dive into that now. Let's just see what Barry has to say about this.
Learned. He had taken classes in philosophy, and he took his materialism very seriously indeed. He had also studied Nietzsche, and there's one of his writings. I love Nietzsche.
Nietzsche? I've never heard his name pronounced that way. Okay.
And so if you want to know what motivated Eric Harris, you should just take his own personal word for it. And in the book, I quote from one of his writings, which kind of summarizes it. And I'll quote from it again, and I'll expletive deleted. There's lots of expletives here. But if there's one quotation that sums up Harris's views, it's probably this one. F money, F justice, F morals, F civilized, F rules, F laws. Die, man-made words. He shouts die. People think they apply to everything when they don't, can't. There's no such thing as true good or true evil. It's all relative to the observer. It's all just nature, chemistry, and math. And so if you see that written down and you look at the basement tapes where he's talking with Klebold and again, the totality of the evidence, Eric Harris's motivation was materialism, funneled through Darwinism, funneled through Nietzsche. And fundamentally, Columbine was a massive act of Nietzschean will. Eric Harris thought he was an Ubermensch, and this is the way he was going to demonstrate it.
It's really a chilling claim to make, and it's kind of amazing. If we want to be able to, address issues like this, we got to diagnose it properly. And I haven't heard a lot of people say what you said. Now, of course, I did not have access to those files. I was reading newspapers and magazines and listening to news coverage of this. So that gives you a very different perspective. But you said materialism is at the root of this. I'm just going to define it the way you do in your book, just so people know what you're talking about, because that word can mean different things. You say it's the idea that matter moved by mindless forces explains all of reality. So there's no supernatural realm. All can be reduced down to or explained by matter and material forces in motion. This is what Nietzsche believed. This is what Eric Harris believed, and he described as the justification for this massacre. Now, describe what's the thesis then at the heart of your book?
Okay, so chapter 2 is called Materialism 101, where I go into what do materialists actually believe. And as you just indicated, you summarized there, they believe that all of reality can be reduced to, it's a very reductionist theory that can be reduced to the fundamental forces operating on the fundamental particles. Everything results from that. That necessarily excludes everything that's immaterial, such as an immaterial God. Now, this gets us directly to Hume. And Hume famously said, you cannot derive an ought from an is. And so if all we are is just amalgamations of burnt out star stuff, if everything that about me, Barry Arrington, or you, Sean.
This is probably why we shouldn't get lawyers to do philosophy for us. I mean, I'm sure that there are lawyers who are good philosophers. This guy isn't one of them. Let's hope that Sean pushes back on this, because this is a gross mischaracterization of Hume's dictum. But let's see what
Sean McDowell is reducible to the chemicals that compose your physical bodies. Well, you're fundamentally no different from a rock morally. There's no such thing as it's absurd to talk about an immoral or immoral rock. Well, materialist believes that fundamentally.
All right, I know Sean knows better than this, so
kind of rock, and that the carbon in your body and the other trace elements in your body is all you are. and therefore there is no good, there's no moral basis, especially there's no transcendent God in whose being goodness can be grounded. That has
Well, there's definitely no transcendent being in whose nature goodness can be grounded under naturalism or materialism. That's certainly true. So I agree with that point. But let's see what Sean said. I don't know that he looks entirely happy with that expression. Anyway.
ramifications.
Okay.
And one of the ramifications it has.
Oh, we're not going to push
And I was
back?
thinking about this. I was writing an article several years ago about critical theory, and I thought, well, these people believe that everything revolves around power dynamics. There's no good, there's no evil. There's just the weak and the strong, oppressors and oppressed. How can they believe this sort of thing? And then I thought, wait a minute. Critical theory is simply materialism applied to human relations. And if you accept
hang on. I got to jump back here. He's now jumping from Hume to critical theory, which is quite a leap. What was he saying about
critical, strong, oppressors and oppressed, critical theory. And I thought, well, these people believe that everything revolves around power dynamics.
Yeah.
There's no good, there's no evil.
There's no good, there's no evil. So most of the critical theorists that I know of write in very strong, emotive, well, a lot of the time they might write in very strong, emotive, moralistic language. Take Marx as a classic example, right? Whilst many of these, I mean, many thinkers wouldn't necessarily be moral realists, though some would be. I suspect probably Marx was, given his view about history and the necessary changes from one society to another. He thought about it as like scientific law. So I don't know if there's been a lot of analysis to this, but it certainly seems someone like Marx could easily be interpreted as espousing realism about morals, for example, as being a moral realist. But anyway, I don't think, irrespective of whether they're moral realists or not, that's kind of actually not what Barry was even talking about. He was saying that they don't think there's any difference between good and evil. That's what he said, right?
These people believe that everything revolves around power dynamics.
That's fair. Power dynamics is very important in critical theory. But then he says
there's no good, there's no evil.
Yeah, there's no good, there's no evil, right? So that's not even a question about moral realism, because you can be a relativist or a constructivist or an emotivist about morality and still think that there's good and evil. You just interpret it differently. That's essentially an error theorist view or a strong nihilist view. It's not even clear that Nietzsche thought something like that. I don't think that Nietzsche actually was a moral nihilist in this sense. Probably he was some sort of constructivist. I'm not entirely sure. But I don't think that Barry really understands the difference between any of these positions. But the point I want to make is that most people writing in a critical theory tradition have as one of their objectives the political and social economic emancipation of oppressed groups. And I think that it's very hard to make sense of that without some notion of right and wrong, good and evil. Not necessarily a moral realist one, though it could be, but at least some notion of that. And I don't think many of these theorists would agree that there's no good or evil in any sense. Some may, and obviously they'll generally want to talk about like the social construction of these concepts and how they're used, right? But to say that there's no, just categorically there is none. Very few philosophers actually say that. That there are a few, that, as I said, most of the error theorists, like Mackey, for example. Now he's one you could point out, who an atheist and a materialist, who does argue that there is no good and evil. But that's quite a strong view and very much in the minority, even amongst materialists. So it'd be nice if Barry were to sort of, clarify this point that most materialists don't think that there's no good or evil, like in any sense. Exactly. That's what I was just saying. Most people in critical theory still think there's good and evil and justice is good, right? They maybe conceive of them a bit differently, right? But they don't think that there is categorically none, as Barry is saying here. I don't know where he got that idea from. Probably, look, his remarks that he made at the start about being bombarded and attacked when he went to university may be probative, because I think one explanation of that is that he doesn't understand the difference between someone who disagrees with him about something and someone who just rejects that thing. Like if someone disagrees with him about justice, he interprets that perhaps as that they don't believe in justice. If someone disagrees about the nature of goodness or the nature of law or whatever, that he interprets that as they're not believing in it and they're attacking it. That would be consistent with the number of remarks he's made, and that might explain why he thinks that people who disagree with him about the nature of good, for example, or good and evil and morality, don't think there is any such thing, instead of just having different views about it. Anyway, let's keep going.
It's just the weak and the strong, oppressors and oppressed. How can they believe this sort of thing? And then I thought, wait a minute. Critical theory is simply
so notice the loaded question there. How can they believe this? And now he's trying to answer that question. But it's not established that they do believe this, right? Like, have you stopped beating your wife yet? But you haven't actually established that they do believe this. You've just said that they do. Again, it's not even clear. He mentioned Nietzsche and Hume. So I mean, Hume certainly didn't believe that there's no good and evil. And I don't think Nietzsche did either, although he's much harder to interpret. But I mean, Nietzsche, I mean, I wouldn't really call him a critical theorist either. It's sort of a bit hard to say, but it would be nice to have some examples of specific people who said specific things, which we can then respond to, instead of just, oh, these critical theory people, whoever they are, believe that there's no good and evil. And then asking, well, why do they think that? We're trying to answer a question that's predicated on an assumption that hasn't even been explained or defended. And the reason that's important is because he's going to say, well, the reason for this is materialism. But we haven't even established that there is even an issue there. That is, all of these people thinking that there's that these scholars thinking that there's no good and evil. Why do they think that? Well, because of materialism. We haven't even established that they do think that.
Materialism applied to human relations. And if you accept that as your premise, their conclusions actually follow. And it really is that there's nothing governing human relations except power dynamics. That's what materialism ultimately teaches. Now, there have been various efforts to ground ethics and morality and things other than God in a materialist ethical system, if you will. They've all failed spectacularly, because at the end of the day, Hume,
I guess we'll just take your word for it then. I think he's going to bring it back to Hume's dictum. Good, because I didn't talk about that before.
Was right. You cannot derive an ought from an is. And therefore, if materialism is correct, it really is about power, those who have it and those who don't.
Maybe this guy's just like really good at manipulating juries. I don't know. Because he sucks at arguing. Like, it's even worse than usual. Okay, so let's take a few points here. First, let's start, because he started with Hume's dictum. You can't get an ought from an is. I've talked about this many times before. It's one of the apologists' favorite, or probably the favorite quote from Hume. That usually they hate Hume, but here they like him because they don't understand him. Yeah, they say, well, look, Hume showed that you can't get an ought from an is. That means that without God, you can't have any theory of morality or grounding for morals, right? Well, that's just blatantly false. So first of all, what Hume was saying is that if you start, Hume was making a point about the logical structure of arguments. Maybe I'll make myself big for this part because I'm going to be rambling for a little bit. So if you have a series of premises which have only declarative, like is statements in them and no ought or moral or normativity aspects to them, just a series of declarative statements, like positive statements, is statements, and then you have a conclusion that contains a moral or normative or like ought component to it, then that argument is always going to be invalid, because you need to have at least one premise that links the is to the oughts, right? Whatever your ises are and whatever your oughts are, you need to have at least one premise that links them together. This is a structural point about deductive arguments. You always need to draw the link between what's contained in your premises and in your conclusion. And that's not even specific to morality. This is true for any type of argument. If you have predicates that talk about one thing in your premises and a different thing in your conclusion, you need to establish how they link together, when you'll need at least one premise to do that. And this is a point that Hume was making. Note that this point A is not unique to moral arguments or normativity in any way, and B applies just as much to any theistic attempt to ground morality. So if one of your premises is like God commands something, or such and such a characteristic is part of God's nature, you can't conclude that therefore that thing is objectively right or we ought to do it without including a premise like, if something is part of God's nature, it is right, or if something is part of God's nature, we ought to do it. You need a linking premise to link the statement about God's nature or God's commands with how we ought to behave, or the proper grounding of morals, or however the argument's going to work. So Hume's dictum applies to any type of deductive argument that works this way. You can have other types of arguments, like abductive arguments, that don't necessarily rely on this sort of strict linear relationship between premises. You're still going to need linking statements there, but the logic works a bit differently. So Hume's dictum, I don't think, applies in quite the same way. But the insight does, that you need to explain how you get an ought statement out of a series of is statements. It needs to be part of your theory that articulates this. Theists don't somehow get a get out of jail free card. They aren't exempt from Hume's dictum. It applies to everyone and every metaethical theory. I don't understand how theists miss this point. They say on the one hand that materialists can't explain how to get an ought from an is, and then literally the next second they say, oh, theists can get oughts from the is of God's nature, right? Or God's nature is a certain way, or God's commandments are such and such, without drawing the obvious connection that that's just getting an ought from an is, in the same way that they say the materialists can't. It's mind-boggling how they don't see this. And it's a rank misunderstanding of Hume to think that he was making an argument against a general naturalist project of grounding morality, which he certainly was not. Okay, so that's Hume's dictum. Now, the point that he said that if you assume the materialist assumptions or axioms, then it does follow that there is no good and evil or no morality. And also it follows that all that matters for human relations, all that determines human relations is power dynamics. So neither of those things are defended, first off. And second of all, notice that those are two distinct different arguments. So let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that some sort of moral nihilism or moral anti-realism does follow from materialism. It doesn't also follow from that power dynamics is all that determines human relations, or is all that's important. Like that's just a completely separate issue. He never even tried to explain where that came from. It's just sort of thrown in there. You could have a view about all sorts of things that affect human relations and are causally important, without holding the view that power is all that matters. The thing that's ironic is that it seems to be the theist view that's most reasonably subject to this criticism. The idea that, well, God is all powerful, so therefore he has some sort of automatic right to determine what is good and evil. Like, well, exactly where does that come from? Now they might say, well, it's his all good nature that gives him that right. But then we have to ask, well, in what does God's all good nature consist? And if it consists in him having a series of virtues like loving and forgiving and just and these other things, it seems like that those virtues are actually the ground of morality and not anything about God as such. It's him possessing those virtues that makes him good, and therefore it's the virtues that are the ultimate ground of goodness, and God at best is only an exemplar of those and not actually the ground itself. You see, God could be the ultimate example of a good person, but that doesn't mean that he's the ground of goodness. It's those properties or those characteristics, those virtues, that are actually the ground of goodness. If you're to say that there's some automatic link between being powerful and being the ground of morality, then it's actually the theist who seems to be saying that it's power that is the ultimate ground of social relations. Like our relation to God is fundamentally a power dynamic. That seems to be far more baked into the theist worldview, certainly a Christian worldview, than to the materialist worldview, who really can appeal to anything that exists in the material world as being sort of critical, or as being the ground for morality or the ground for social relations or whatever. So I don't know why Barry is appealing to that specifically. He hasn't even tried to present any argument for that. So that's mixed in with this notion of moral nihilism or moral anti-realism, which is also mixed in with Hume's dictum, which is fundamentally misunderstood. And then he also drew a vague link to Nietzsche, which he, again, didn't understand or explain very well. I don't know how this connects to the Columbine massacre, because two troubled teenagers who maybe misunderstood or took some ideas from Nietzsche, I don't know what implications that's supposed to have for literally anyone. So I'm just going to put that to the side, because I don't know how it's relevant to anything that he said. And the final point that I want to make is that he has said, and he acknowledged, which is at least something, that there have been numerous attempts to explain morality under naturalist assumptions, materialist assumptions. And he said they all fail spectacularly, without giving a single example or argument as to how or why they have failed, which will be interesting to hear. And hopefully they'll get into that in a bit more detail. But rather than, he had the opportunity to develop his case carefully, but what he's done instead is spewed out a bunch of nonsense. We had an appeal to Nietzsche, we had an appeal to Hume, we had a discussion of critical theory and everything being about power. And somehow these are all, and then we had moral nihilism, which I think is sort of distinct from Hume and Nietzsche. And somehow these are all just sort of mixed up together in this big soup of materialism and well, not even implied, stated to be the cause of all of our ills. So that there's no actual argument here. There's just a big stew with a bunch of things that Barry and plausibly many theists will not like or feel uncomfortable with, like Nietzsche, for example, in critical theory. And yeah, like maybe this works on juries. It's sort of scary if this sort of approach does. I don't know, but it certainly doesn't work in philosophy, because this is a shamble. This is leftovers night, right? Where you just grab everything that's in the fridge and mix it all up, throw it in the microwave or throw it in the pot. Like, this isn't actually an argument or a carefully developed set of ideas. It's just a joke. Anyway.
Of course, you have a chapter in your book going into defending what you just said. And I've actually talked about that at length here. I've had debates with a number of atheist lawyers and thinkers like Michael Shermer making that case. So people can refer to your chapter, they can refer to my debates. But I agree with you in principle. In a materialistic universe, there's no soul, there's no free will. Objective meaning and objective purpose are an illusion. There's no life after death.
Hang on. I didn't catch if Sean is saying this or if Sean is saying that this is what Barry argues in the book. Let me just jump back a second here.
Free will, objective, I agree with you in principle. In a materialistic universe, Shermer making that case, so people can refer to your chapter.
Okay, so Sean is now saying that Barry has a chapter defending that. Well, isn't that the point of this? I mean, we've done this before, right? Where I watched the video, which is like an hour or more long, and the guest completely fails to even start making a coherent case for whatever they're arguing for. But then it turns out that really the video is just a commercial for their book. And we're told, oh, look, read the book if you actually want an argument for it. In which case, well, look, sure, they can develop it in more detail in the book, but if you can't do it in an hour's video, like even make a decent start, why would I bother reading the book? And they've already had 14 minutes and he said really nothing of substance. He's just made a bunch of vague claims that many theists will sort of vaguely feel happy about, but no real arguments there. Okay, so I'm not going to read the book unless you can provide me with some good reasons to think that that's actually going to be a good use of my time. And so far, he's failed to do that. So then Sean
debates, but I agree with you in principle.
Okay, so now Sean is saying, so that's really frustrating, because I know that there are things that even Sean's going to take issue with that Barry just said there. But he's just sort of saying, well, look, never mind about that. That's defended in your book, so we can wave that away. Maybe they'll come back to it later, but I wouldn't hold my breath. But now Sean is saying that he agrees fundamentally with what Barry has said, and now he's going to articulate a number of points. So this is Sean speaking here.
In a materialistic universe, there's no soul. There's no.
Let's take these one at a time. So there's no soul. I'm going to agree with that. Look, maybe you could try to defend a soul materialistically, and I think that potentially in the Hindu tradition, there are some people who've tried to do that, Hindu or Buddhist tradition. But I'm just going to say, yeah, sure, souls are immaterial in the way that it's usually conceived of. So I'll agree with that. I know no great loss, in my opinion, by the way. I don't think that there's anything of significance lost there other than a bundle of confusions. But I'll agree with him. No soul. So what comes next?
Free will.
No free will. Well, if you think that free willing is the soul deciding, then I suppose that does follow. But I mean, the majority of philosophers are compatibilists about free will, which is to say that free will is consistent with determinism, which is a view that is friendly to a materialist worldview. So obviously, there's a long conversation to be had there, but it's not obvious that follows.
Objective meaning and objective purpose are an
objective meaning and objective purpose. Those are harder to unpack because there's not as clear developed philosophical positions about what objective meaning and objective purpose mean. I think particularly meaning is something that is at least partly constructed. Someone can't just give you a meaning. It has to at least in part be something that you value. Maybe it can't be anything arbitrarily that you value. Maybe it has to be combined with something outside of you, something that's objectively good or something. But I think that meaning has to be at least something that we have a positive attitude towards, a striving for, that gives us some value. And the importance of that is that meaning, the reason I say that is because meaning can't be, in this sense, purely objective. It can't just be, again, we think about, I don't think theists really know what they mean when they say objective and subject. I think that Nathan's made this point before. When they say objective, they seem to just mean like really real, as opposed to subjective, which is like fake or not real. That's not what objective and subjective mean. And the meaning is a bit different depending on the context. But if we take it back to the root, right? So an objective relates to an object, which is something that is out there, distinct from me, that I sort of observe and treat in a sense passively, that I act upon. It's distinct from a subject, which is like an agent, a seat of some sort of awareness or decision-making capability. So I particularly am a subject. Presumably other people are subjects as well. They have a point of view that is subjective because it is essentially connected to and derivative from that subject, right? So deriving from a subject is subjective, whereas deriving from an object is objective. And that's a useful distinction in some contexts. Like many people think that at least some aesthetic taste judgments are subjective because they derive from things internal to the subject, like whether I like a certain flavor of ice cream, strawberry or chocolate. Few people, I think, would think that there is an objective, that is purely object-derived answer to that question as which is aesthetically preferable. Now, when it comes to other types of judgments, like moral judgments, there are many people who think that there are objective answers to that, answers that are not entirely derivative from subjects, although maybe there's a combination there. Many people think that there are at least objective statements relating to laws of nature, for example, or physical laws or facts, if you don't like law talk, like the mass of an electron, for example. People would typically say that that is objective in the sense that the value is not derivative of or dependent on any particular subject's opinions or desires or mental states. It's a fact of the world that we discover. Obviously, we do so through a subjective process. We don't have direct insight into the world. We can't just read the mass off electron or something like that. We have to do inference, and so there's a complex story to tell there. But at least there's an idea, if you're some kind of realist about science, that there is a value out there to be found in the object in some sense, or at least not entirely derivative of my subject, like any particular subject. So this is something like, obviously it's more complicated than that, but this is something like the subjective-objective distinction, right? And critically, of course, something being subjective doesn't mean it's not real, and something being objective doesn't mean that it's really real. It's just a different. I see it as a different basis of where things are grounded, like what makes things true, whether it's something sort of internal to inside of a person, particularly relating to their psychological judgments or desires, or something external outside of them. So the point that I wanted to make there is that because meaning is something inherently, at least partly subjective, it can't be wholly objective. Meaning can't be something out there that you find in an object. It may be partly objective in that things that give a person meaning may relate to facts outside of them. It might just not be their own personal pleasure, for example. It might be doing things for other people, or building things in the world, or things that happen in the future, right? Making a legacy. Those are things that are not just entirely within your mind or subjectivity, that they're sort of outside of you in some sense. So you might think there's an interplay between the subjective and the object when giving rise to meaning. Or maybe you think it's entirely subjective. I think that, an argument can be made there. But what I don't think you can say is that meaning is entirely objective. If it's to be meaningful to you, it has to at least, in some sense, interplay with your subjectivity. And, there's a complicated story to tell there, right? Obviously, theists will tend to think that meaning comes from God in some sense, but presumably that's in a relational sense, like meaning, I derive meaning from my relationship with God. And that's obviously partly subjective because it's a relationship. Like that's the whole point of two subjectivities relating to each other. And I think that they don't want to say this because they think of subjective as like fake and bad, which is not what it means. And they think of objective as like good and real, which again is not what it means. And so that's why they use these terminology, but that's not what the terms mean. If we want to use them, they do have value, these terms, but they need to be used carefully. If we're going to use them in this silly way, I think we should just avoid talking about them and use other language that's clearer, because I don't think the way that Sean is using objective here, like objective meaning and objective purpose, is really clarifying what he's talking about at all. Anyway, that's a bit of a long discursus, but I think this matters, right? Because this is the shtick that apologists will often do, right? They'll say under materialism, you can't have objective morality, you can't have objective meaning, you can't have objective purpose. And they won't explain what they mean by objective or why you can't have objective things under materialism. Remember that materialism is an objectivist philosophy in the sense that it grounds, it's radically objectivist, much more than a dualist philosophy. A dualist philosophy, remember, is one that says there are fundamental subjectivities, which is like a soul or an immaterial mind or something like that. Panpsychists also believe this. They actually believe that everything has sort of subjectivist properties like qualia or proto-qualia or something like that, proto-consciousness. and God is obviously an immaterial subjectivity. Whereas materialists believe that there are no fundamental subjectivities. The subjectivity is real, but it exists in virtue of objects like particles or fields or whatever that come together in certain ways. And this is also distinct from views like idealism, which says that in some sense everything is everything that we can say anything about, at least, is subjective, is like ideas, and we can really only interface with other ideas. What exists beyond that, if anything, we can't say anything about. And so the point is, if you're really going to get into this sort of objective, subjective language, materialism is one of the most objectivist philosophies, and that it says that everything that exists fundamentally is an object. There's no subjectivity to it. There's no perspective of it. It's just a thing that interacts through causal laws or physical laws with other things, and that in certain contexts can give rise to agents, animals, people who have a subjective experience, who have a point of view, and who can act. But at base, there's no subjectivities. So I think that the objection is going to be that you can't build a subjectivity out of just objective inert matter, right? I think that's what people like Sean want to argue, but they need to argue that. They can't just use words like subjective and objective as if that's somehow a criticism of materialism, that it's all subjective, because in a sense that's the opposite of what materialists say. So there are, of course, various arguments out there from philosophy of mind and whatever else, but you need to develop those arguments carefully in interaction with what physicalists actually say, and not just throw out these sort of platitudes. That's the sort of point I want to make. So Nathan and Craig, I have absolutely no idea what you're arguing about in chat, but can you stop, please? Because I like to get a sense of if people have questions that are actually related to the video, and you've just sort of swamped chat. So I don't know what that was about. Ronnie, materialism is not showing USA. What is doing that is Christian fundamentalism. I think I largely agree. I think there are other things that are having issues as well, but that's a part of it. Yeah, so this is a good point as well. Objective, hate that word, too many definitions. It can mean whatever you want it to mean. And that's the problem, right? So I've given an articulation that I think relates more to the sort of philosophical usage of it, which I think, again, can be useful. But if it's used in a sort of a apologetic way to just mean like really real and good in some sense, and subject is like bad and fake, well, then we need to dispense with that usage, because that's really not helpful at all. That's the sort of a chest thumping or a table thumping usage. Anyway, let's move on with the video.
Illusion. There's no life after death. There's no objective moral values.
Yeah, so we're going through Sean's list about things that don't exist. There's no life after death. Note that doesn't follow from materialism at all. I don't know why people say this. So I don't believe in life after death, and most materialists don't. But it certainly doesn't follow from, like, how does it follow from materialism? There's no life after death. You think about it for 3 seconds and you realize, well, all there would need to be for life after death is some sort of physical process that brings back together the material pieces that constitute you. And there are ways that you could imagine doing that through natural forces. Perhaps if our universe worked very differently to what it does, it's much harder under actual physical laws, but like it's at least conceivable. But there's also things like mind uploading, which you could argue could be forms of life after death. Or maybe aliens have advanced technology that could bring us back in thousands of years. Like, maybe our whole universe is a simulation, and the simulator of that universe could reinstantiate us at some point down the line. Like, there's obviously ways that there could be life after death in a physical universe. Now, there's not going to be heaven and hell in the way that theists think about it. So again, I think that this is just lack of imagination. When Sean says there's no life after death, there's just obviously no life after death in a physicalist universe. What he means is there's no life after death in the way that Sean thinks about it. But he's not really willing to think about it in other ways. Like, when he says there's no objective morality, he means there's no morality in the way that he thinks about morality, because he thinks morality is the stuff that comes from God, right? And obviously that doesn't exist under materialism, so there just isn't any morality. It's the complete inability to see things from different perspectives. What a good philosopher should do is start with a question. Ideally, you try to make it as precise as possible, but there's always some vagueness there. Like, what is the nature of morality, for example? What's going on there? Like, we talk about shoulds and shouldn'ts and goods and bads, but what's behind that? Like, let's try to theorize about this. And then what you should do is you should take the different theories that people have developed over, many years of arguing about this and assess them on their explanatory merits. What are the arguments for and against? What do they explain? What do they leave unexplained? And what do they have to postulate and so forth? And then you can adopt a view that you think is better, or you can extend a view, or you can remain agnostic. There's different options, right? But that doesn't seem to be what Sean does, or at least it's not what he's doing here, right? And in fact, it's not really what any apologist does. What they do is they start with their own views about something, and then everyone who thinks differently just doesn't believe in the things that their theory tries to explain. Like, a moral theory isn't an attempt to explain morality. A moral theory is just like the true morality, right? Same with free will. Libertarian free will, in the way that Sean understands it, is just free will, right? And so anyone who rejects that rejects free will. They don't have a different theory of understanding free will. They just don't believe in it. Same with morality, same with purpose, same with life after death. Like, it goes for everything like this, right? This is my way to make sense of why they say such silly things, right? It's because they're not willing to actually take a step back from their current worldview and evaluate things in a fair way. They're not willing to say, look, the way that I understand morality is such and such. And so if you reject God, then you're not going to have that type of morality. But there are other theories that you can use to understand morality, but I don't think they're as good for X, Y, and Z. No, they'll just say there's no morality, right? You see the difference between having a particular view of why one theory for something is better and arguing for why that's better compared to other theories, and then just declaring that, on the other hand, just declaring that anyone who doesn't agree with your preferred interpretation of something just doesn't believe in that thing, full stop. One is good philosophy, the other is bad. And that's like, at that point is almost like what I do on this channel. Like, it's just trying to make that distinction. So it's frustrating to see that Sean is just, I think, falling into that trap. Telling someone in dispute that their view is true in the imagination but not in reality is question begging. I don't know if that's actually a response to me, but like, that does seem to be, similar to what I'm talking about here. All right, let's move on.
And duties. I think that follows. Now, the obvious question, Barry, is that the vast majority of people committed to that worldview don't do what Harris and Klebold did. I have friends and extended family members who are materialists, and some of the best citizens and friends and people that I know. So why be concerned about a doctrine that we see this rare, terrible case, of course, I'm not downplaying it, but it feels like an exception as a whole to people who hold that worldview? Why be so concerned about it, especially when it was 25 years ago?
So that's a good point. Why bring this up when it doesn't appear to be representative of most materialists? And it was quite a while ago. So is that what's destroying America today? Let's see what he says.
And so that's a very good question. And the answer is, you're right. Most people, the vast majority of materialists, do not act on their principles. As a matter of fact, it is a fact that if you're a materialist, you have to act. You base your life on the assumption or the working assumption, if you will, that your fundamental assumptions about reality are false. In the book, I have an interview between Richard Dawkins and the guys over at Trigonometry. I don't know if you see Trigonometry. And Constantine asks Dawkins about this. He says, look, we all act as if we have free will, that we're free moral agents. Yet, and you, Richard Dawkins, you're one of the world's leading moralists and scolding moralists. And you're always saying this is right, this is wrong. Yet, if you take your philosophy seriously, as a matter of fact, you have said that at bottom, there is no good, there is no evil. How do you square that circle? Richard Dawkins.
Again, this reflects so that Dawkins quote is another one of the favorite apologists' quotes. I do want to say that I'm not a big fan of Dawkins, and I don't think he's a very good philosopher, but this quote is abused so much. So the materialist does agree with Dawkins in this sense, that they do agree that at bottom there is no good and no evil and no design, and he lists a bunch of other things. I can't remember what they all are. But here's the point. What the apologists always seem to miss, and I'm not sure what Dawkins is about to say. Maybe Dawkins himself even misses this. What the apologists completely miss is the first words, at bottom, right? At bottom, there's no good and evil. That doesn't mean there's no good and evil, right? At bottom in our reality, like fundamentally, there's no tables and chairs. There's no people. There's no plants, right? There's no colors. Like there's almost nothing at bottom, right? It's like fundamental particles and force fields and things like that, right? That's what a materialist thinks exists at bottom. And now a theist doesn't think that. They think at bottom there's God, right? So this is a difference, right? This is one of the key differences about what is fundamental, what grounds everything else, what's primary. And yes, a materialist does think that at bottom, you don't have any of these features because they think that those things are emergent, or in other words, I mean, that word's abused a lot as well, but it just means that that all of those things are made up of the smaller building blocks that in themselves don't have, meaning or purpose or morality. Like, protons don't have meaning, purpose, or morality, but a whole bunch of them together with neutrons and electrons in the right way, according to the materialist, can have purpose and morality, or at least many materialists would say that, including myself, right? Now, you can, of course, argue against that, but what you really can't do in good conscience is to say that the materialist is committed to the view that either morality exists at bottom or it doesn't exist at all. But that's a crazy view. Like, why would you think that? The theist might think that, but the materialist doesn't have to think that. Just like computers don't exist at bottom, phones don't exist at bottom, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. So this is really not a complicated point, but somehow every apologist ever just misses it. Anyway, so let's see how Dawkins responds.
Dawkins was at a loss. He couldn't square that circle and hurried on and wanted to talk about other things.
I don't really believe that report. But anyway, regardless of what Dawkins did or did not say, I agree with his quote that at bottom there aren't any of these things, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means they don't exist at bottom. And this is what a lot of apologists completely fail to see, is that to say that something doesn't exist fundamentally is not to say that it doesn't exist.
And so the fact is, materialists don't act as if materialism is true by and large. And the reason for that, of course, is we believe as Christians that materialism isn't true, that God has placed in the heart of.
So Craig, if when you have capital O ontologically with quotes around it, if by that you mean like in terms of fundamental ontology, then I agree with that. But ontology can just refer to what exists, and in which case I would disagree. So words become a bit difficult here. There's examples one could give, but I think that would get us a bit off track. But I think it's easy just to say, like, what do you think is the fundamental constituents that make up everything else? So that the materialist says that anything that has meaning in virtue of minds, which in turn exists in virtue of tissue and organs and things arranged in a certain way, and electrical activity in brains, and all of that is ultimately physical, right? So purpose, morality, meaning, pleasure, pain, and all of that is derived. It exists in virtue of more fundamental things. Whereas the theist denies that, or at least many theists deny that, or all theists deny that about God, and there's different views about human purposes. But they think that at least in the case of God, meaning, purpose, and mentality is fundamental to reality. It's at the bottom, it precedes these other things, and it's the ultimate cause and ground of them. So that's a fundamental difference there. But that doesn't tell you anything about what exists. It's only about what's fundamental. But there's a confusion here amongst a lot of apologists, and frankly other people as well, between what exists and what exists fundamentally. It's true that the materialist doesn't think, I think almost definitionally, that there exists mentality fundamentally, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Now, sometimes in philosophy, we focus a lot on the fundamental, the ontological grounding of a theory, which, there's a value to that, but we shouldn't get overly distracted by that. Just because something doesn't exist fundamentally doesn't in some way mean it's less important or less real. It just means that it's a certain way of existing.
Every human being a sense of what is right and what is wrong. Romans chapter 2 is very clear about this. But nevertheless, this idea of materialism is corrosive to our culture, especially in my field, the law, where about 130 years ago it started to take over, and in politics and in our conception of our polity. And when you take materialism seriously in politics, you have to give up on the Declaration of Independence. So what do I mean?
Okay, he's got to explain that. I didn't expect to see that coming.
By that, well, the Declaration says it is self-evident that all men are created equal and that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including life.
Well, yeah, okay, but so obviously then a materialist doesn't think that the universe has a creator. Although I think that you theoretically can. Nearly all materialists won't think this. But I think that a universe that is simulated by other material beings who live in some sort of higher universe, of which ours is just a simulation, like that would be a materialist view that also could have a creator. It's also possible that we could be created by aliens within our universe, for example, who could have seeded us, maybe guided evolution through some advanced technologies. Again, there are possibilities here if you watch science fiction. I'm not defending any of those. I'm just saying that you can't, as a matter of logic, say that these positions can't exist when, like, you just have to think about it for a few seconds and realize they can. That being said, most materialists will not think that our universe has a creator or creators. And therefore, it's true that they won't agree with that passage. But I mean, that's a preamble, right? Like, it doesn't mean you have to give up on it legally. Like that I don't understand what legal argument he's making there, that because you personally don't believe in a creator, therefore you have to reject the Declaration of Independence. I don't know. That just seems like nonsense to me.
And liberty and pursuit of happiness. Well, I quote in the book, materialist authors who say, well, that's not only not self-evidently true, it's self-evidently false in a materialist world.
I had a friendly debate on the Unbelievable show, maybe, I don't know, 6-7 years ago.
So like he just doesn't try to explain why that's relevant for anything. And the founding fathers who wrote this weren't really Christians anyway, or at least not any sort of mainstream Orthodox Christian view. Most of them were deists or various forms of what's what I'm looking for, like non-Orthodox views. Now, I don't know if that has any direct bearing on the Declaration of Independence, but this raises the issue of why it's important not to inject religion into politics, because people have all sorts of different views about these sort of metaphysical and religious issues. And really, there's no need for them to be subject to debate in the political sphere. And indeed, there's a lot of problems with that. But like this argument here that somehow materialism means that you have to give up on the Declaration of Independence, I just don't understand that. So because it mentions something about a creator, why does that mean we have to give up on it? Like, I've just failed to see the connection. And he's a lawyer. He should be able to explain what that connection is supposed to be. I just don't know what it is.
With Ryan Bell, who's a pastor for 20 years, and he was kind of trying on atheism for a year. And I know atheism is not always synonymous with materialism. It can be defined different ways. But I argued to him, I said, I don't think you're really living out for a year what a real atheism would imply. You're still borrowing certain things from the Christian worldview. If you were to live out atheism, this is what it would look like. Now, he pushed back, and folks can go watch that and make up their own minds. But I'm with you on aspects.
They haven't actually said what it looked like. So they've said that you can't believe in free will if you're a materialist without any justification or explanation. But let's suppose that that's true, right? Let's suppose that there's no free will. What does that follow about how you should act, or acting consistently? Maybe should you can't even use, right? If there's no ought, which they also didn't defend. But what does it look like to act consistently with the view that there is no free will? Is there any substance to that? Like, I have no idea, because they haven't told us what that looks like. Barry has implied that it looks like shooting up a school, but he hasn't explained why. The closest we had was something about, well, if there's no like free will and good and evil, then all it is power dynamics relating to critical theory. Okay, let's suppose that we did think that. How does that lead you to shooting up a school? Like, because that seems like kind of a dumb thing to do, right? Like, it didn't end well for the perpetrators. So, like, I'm trying to understand how any of this is supposed to fit together, even if you assume the points that they have assumed without defending. And none of it's making any sense to me.
Asking the question, if there's no God, there's no soul, and materialism is true, what follows culturally and what follows personally? Now, I'm an apologist and evangelist, so the question about the cultural implications of this are important, but secondary to me, as opposed to the personal, faith of an individual. You deal with both.
Thanks, Humpty. Appreciate that. Sorry, just having a quick look at chat here. All men are created equal, didn't they have slaves? Well, many of them did, but we don't talk about that. The founding fathers were Russian Orthodox, like any patriot would be today. What's happened here? So when does the part start where he explains how materialism destroys America? Well, he said it many times. So, okay, so let's try to explain. Let's try to summarize what he said so far, what they've both sort of said so far. So, first of all, materialism is the view that everything is made of material, like matter and energy, and moving about under physical laws. Okay, that's fine. We'll go with that. It follows from that there is no big list of things. So, objective morality, objective purpose and meaning, life after death, free will, I think, were the main things that he's mentioned. None of these were even, they didn't even try to defend any of these. I think a vague reference, or they mentioned Hume's dictum, right? But of course, misunderstood that and then didn't explain how theism somehow gets around it, which it doesn't. And so then we're on to the point that, so if materialists lived consistently with these views, lived them out consistently, then you get lots of bad stuff. And really all we've had so far is shooting up schools as an example. We haven't been told what it looks like, or what it would look like to live consistently with, no free will, no morality, no purpose. We've got a gesturing that it looks something like shooting up schools, but no explanation as to why that's the case. That's where we're at so far. So, but there's still a ways to go. So maybe they'll explain it a bit
this
better.
book, we will come back to your cultural critique, but you did say something in the book I wanted to push into a little bit. You said materialism is...
So this is actually a good point, right? Can't he just give empirical evidence? I don't know if they will, but the problem with empirical evidence is that it's very hard to establish causality in complex issues like that. So like, suppose you have a secular nation that has higher crime rate than a religious nation. Does that mean it has a higher crime rate because it's secular? Or vice versa, right? You see the problem here. How do you know that everything else is the same? Unless you can experimentally intervene and impose religion on a society for a certain amount of time, or impose materialism on society for a certain amount of time, it's sort of hard to know how you would make that determination. Interestingly, you could argue that the introduction of communism in, say, Russia or China is sort of an attempt to do that, like impose materialism on a society. The problem with that is, of course, all of the confounds, because that wasn't randomly assigned to a society, and many other things are imposed on that society that are not part of the minimal package of materialism. Like Marxism is a very specific brand of materialism, and the totalitarian or authoritarian rules that went along with that also a very particular interpretation of Marxism, or bastardization of Marxism, depending on who you ask. So anyway, the point I'm making is it's very difficult to marshal empirical evidence for these sorts of claims, which is generally why I am not a fan of this sort of reasoning. Now, to be fair, they haven't made that sort of argument in this video. I think they've made even worse arguments, but yeah, it's very difficult to tell just sort of through empiricals across society comparisons as to whether like a very generic set of beliefs is good or bad for society. I think that there are ways you can try to get at that question, but it's very difficult, and you need to marshal. You need to have a cumulative case. But anyway, but that's something that is beyond what we can cover
taken
here.
over the world. Direct quote. I actually see it a little bit differently. I think the supernatural seems to be making a cultural comeback. Whether it's UFOs, sometimes be interpreted that way, interest in psychedelics.
Yeah, I guess there's some UFOs who like read that in a supernatural way. So that's fair.
New Age beliefs. Is it both? Am I wrong? Why put so much emphasis on materialism when there's a lot of voices like Justin Brierley and others saying there's a surprising rebirth of belief in God?
Okay, so this is actually a good point of Sean here. So if you ask people, I don't think that most surveys do ask people about materialism, because most people I don't think they would know straightforwardly what that is. But if you ask people about belief in God, I mean, most people, still in most Western countries, most people express belief in God. Obviously, it does depend on the country, but God or like a higher spirit or something like that. But then you also ask people about things like belief in ghosts, belief in spirits and souls, various other sorts of non-natural or supernatural entities. The vast majority of people in the vast majority of societies, at least Western societies, are absolutely not materialists, even if they're atheists in a traditional sense. Like New Age is a good example of this. Like these people are mostly not materialists, right? They have all sorts of beliefs that are outside of what the sort of strict naturalist materialist would believe. Someone like me, the diehard skeptic, the hard-nosed, nasty sort of person that they seem to be talking about at the outset. So it's funny because this notion of materialism, the straw man that they've constructed, it's not even applicable in the way that they argue, because most people most of like people in the post-Christian society aren't even going for materialism. They're going for other sorts of beliefs, like New Age, for example, or belief in UFOs, or belief in The Secret, like the Oprah Winfrey kind of stuff, right? Although she's a Christian as well, isn't she? But whatever. The point is that like people believe in these other sorts of things. They don't adopt a rigidly materialistic, skeptical attitude towards things, which I think they should, by the way, but they don't by and large. And so this straw man of the materialist isn't even applicable. Like it's not even remotely applicable to the vast majority of people in like post-Christian societies or societies moving away from Christianity. So it's just like, it's so badly placed to be a scapegoat, is my point here. Like you erect this straw man and make it a scapegoat, but like it's not even a good scapegoat, because like it so obviously doesn't apply to the vast majority of people. Yeah, you can be materialist and believe in UFOs. I'm just saying that there are people who believe in UFOs who link it to sort of very supernatural things as well. Like, don't ask me to explain how that all, but yeah, like that's a thing as well. But you could just believe it's purely natural explanations.
So I don't think that you're wrong, Sean, but I think that these things are not incompatible. As a matter of fact, one follows from the other. As our cultural elites, and especially our cultural institutions, law, politics, academia, the media, the overwhelming ethos amongst our elites is materialist. I mean, they just kind of take it for granted. And that trickles down to the society as a whole.
So I think he has and in the sense in which he has a point, I think that Nietzsche made this point, over 100 years ago. It's not that people actually are materialists. It's just in most of their day-to-day interactions and actual decisions, as well as the sorts of rationale that we accept in public life, is predicated largely on materialist assumptions. And that's why, for example, that it's not generally acceptable to invoke supernatural causes for things in societies, right? That's part of the Enlightenment, right? That we don't do that anymore. Many people still believe in, this is important. Many people, including the West, still believe in supernatural causes and miracles and ghosts and other things like that. And in certain contexts, this will come up, but it's not generally acceptable to raise that in serious context. And that is one of the markers of, I would say, a rationalist, secular post-Enlightenment society. Not that these beliefs go away, but it's the social currency that they hold, the role that they play in society. Because this is not true in many places like India and Sub-Saharan Africa, where societies still have a lot more traditional views that are have a wider currency in society. So I think there's a sense in which he's right here, and I think that, and this is why I argue that, well, let's not get into that point. But the point is, I think largely this is a product of the Enlightenment and the development since then. And this is sort of what Nietzsche was talking about, the idea that God is dead, right? God is dead in the sense that we don't need him. We don't need to use or appeal to God in getting by in society, in making decisions in the law, or in running politics, or in attributing causes of diseases, or in understanding the origin of species and the nature of the universe and things like that. That we have other mechanisms and theories, concepts for making sense of these things and for dealing with these things. God is sort of redundant now. And therefore, what happens after that? And then he was talking about, well, the consequences of that for meaning and morality and things like that. But the point is, in this sense, I think that Barry is correct. But he's not completely correct, because there are still people who are pushing to bring back God or other superstitious beliefs, and they're constantly pushing. And it's not just religious. Like, there's alternative medicine is another example where there's all sorts of supernatural or paranormal beliefs that people want to push back into the mainstream. And so far have only had sort of modest success. And often alternative medicine is a good example of this, actually, because you'll at the same time hear people arguing for things like acupuncture or homeopathy, which I think, acupuncture is the clearest example, because it's based on the notion of obstructions of chi flowing around your body, which is a blatantly anti-materialist and pre-modern superstitious belief system that has no basis in science, right? But there'll be attempts to study that with modern scientific principles and to provide rationalistic links to mainstream scientific medicine. And a lot of that research comes out of China, and there's attempts to use that for political purposes. And some people, just genuinely believe it because of their own personal anecdotal experience and whatever else. But the point is that these belief systems, they still exist and they still have influence. They haven't completely gone away, but they're still in many respects outside of the mainstream. At least you would argue until fairly recently in the case of the US, we could argue about the place of non-materialist viewpoints, explicitly, to the extent that they are explicitly governing US policy at the moment. Yeah, I'm reluctant to say more about that right now, but the point is that it hasn't got these viewpoints obviously still exist and haven't gone away. They're still politically influential, but I think that it's correct. Barry's correct in the sense that for quite a long time now, they have struggled to maintain to retain a mainstream position in a lot of our public policy and discourse, especially when you're talking about the universities and the political sphere. What is the difference between materialism and physicalism? In the way that I'm using the terms, none. And I wouldn't expect Barry or Sean to give you any more nuanced distinction either. So I don't think that there's really any point trying to do that. Indeed, yes.
and what we have seen is, unsurprisingly, as those people have had more and more influence, a precipitous rise in the nuns amongst polls on religion. Well, there's a saying widely attributed.
So not having religion, of course, is very different from being a materialist. Let's just clarify that point. It shouldn't need clarifying, but he's making a link there that I don't think is warranted.
To G.K. Chesterton. When men stop believing in God, it's not that they believe in nothing, they'll believe in anything. But we all have a sense of the supernatural in it.
Yes, so that's another one of the quotes that apologists love. I don't know the exact context of Chesterton using that quote, so I won't comment on that, but let's just say that like materialism isn't anything. I think a good example of an ideology that is anti-materialists and also quite horrific is fascism, right? Particularly because Hitler had a very strong sense. I mean, Hitler didn't believe in God in any traditional religious way, but he absolutely believed in some kind of higher power. And he believed that higher power was on his side and that he had some sort of destiny to, to unite Germany and achieve greatness and things like that. If you look at the language of fascist writers, they absolutely do not talk like a materialist. They talk as if morality has a fundamental purpose and a sort of a driving spirit behind it. I mean, they talk about other things as well, like the spirits of nations, for example, which innovate them. And it's sort of hard to make sense of that in a materialist way. Of course, it's hard to make sense of a lot of what like fascist writers say in a rigorous way, because a lot of it's very emotional. It's not necessarily developed as a logical structure. But anyway, the point is there are plenty of examples of non-religious, but nevertheless non-natural, like non-materialist philosophies that exist. Taoism would be another example. Even Buddhism, you could say Buddhism, whether you define it as a religion or not, I mean, I'd probably say that it is a religion, but it's an atheistic religion in the sense that it does not believe in a creator God, but it does believe in, at least traditionally, in all sorts of supernatural agents and forces. So we absolutely should not accept this equation of materialism with atheism. I am both, and many of the people I think Barry is imagining are both. But in fact, most people who are not traditionally religious are not materialists in any sense, right? We've just given a bunch of examples of positions that don't fulfill that, and there are many others as well. Belief in New Age would probably be another one. So I really think that a lot of Barry's enemies are just in his own head. Like, yes, the materialist atheist types do exist, and they are overrepresented in academia, but that doesn't mean that they are primarily responsible for all of the sorts of things that he's talking about, or even mostly, particularly here when he's talking about the rise of the nuns. Most of these nuns I don't think are materialists.
C.S. Lewis called it the numinous. There's just something uncanny about. No one really believes materialism. Everybody understands that there's something more than the physical. And when you reject the God of the Bible, you start looking for substitutes, and that's what we see with the rise of these New Age, for example, people trying to fill.
Dude, you can't simultaneously say that the rise of the nuns and all of these other problems in societies is due to materialism, and at the same time say that it's responsible for New Age. New Agers are almost vastly not materialists, right? They believe in other forms of spirituality. I mean, you can't generalize too much, but I think that that's fair to say that most New Agers are not materialists, certainly not like scientific, skeptical materialists in the tradition of Hume, right? Like, this is just another example of things that I don't like soup. Just put them all together and mix them up, and don't worry about how any of it fits together. It's postmodern neo-Marxism all over again. Like, it's just, well, throw two things that I don't like together, even though they're diametrically opposed. It's just baffling how he gets this. Yeah, what kind of materialism is New Age? Like, I mean, maybe you can, again, there's probably a way to do that, but I don't think that's a very common view, Barry. Like the hardcore skeptical materialist New Agers, yeah, the hordes of them around.
That whole. Now, on the other hand, we're also now seeing people are tired of the materialist shtick, and traditional religions seem to be making a comeback. I think the latest polls is that the nuns have bottomed out and traditional religions making a comeback.
Well, Nathan and I did a video on that in Bad Apologetics. I think the short answer is no, that's not happening, or at the very least that the evidence is not is too early to say that. But anyway, it also kind of undermines his point. Materialism can't simultaneously be destroying American culture and also traditional religiosity making a comeback. I mean, I suppose like you could say, well, materialism's still destroying it, but like, but it's destroying it less because theism is making I don't know. Those seem to, it's like, well, I won't say that. It's hard to make sense of how both of those things can be true, I think.
Okay, that's a helpful way to look at it. I think if you look statistically speaking in our country, it's a minority of people who really hold a materialist belief.
Yes, this is what I say.
I mean, maybe 4 to 7, 8%, depending upon the generation. But it seems like your concern is more with what you kind of consider these elite institutions and power brokers that shape law and culture. They're shaped by materialist beliefs that have powerful cultural implications. If I'm hearing you correctly, this is the case that you're making. So let me pull us to the chapter you have on one that was especially interesting to me. You have apologetic chapters, and I always find that interesting, especially from a lawyer, because you're trained to reason. That stuff I'm very familiar with. But this chapter, less so. I'm not a lawyer. And it was called Lawless Law. And you discuss what you consider the massive influence on the Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. You refer to him as the most influential figure in American jurisprudence in the last 150 years. Who was he, and why were his writings and rulings so monumental and even still so today?
Tended to skip this part because I don't know that much about American jurisprudence, and I don't trust Barry to say anything correct about anything, even though, yes, he is a lawyer, but from everything that he said so far.
This is an excellent question. Oliver was no God, that there was no right, that there was no wrong. He was a nihilist, a thoroughgoing for this.
Yeah, so this is the thing, right? When it's something that I don't know much about, I don't trust Barry to be correct, and so there's not a lot of point in talking and listening to what he has to say about
this. Is all man-made, all man made up, and today the overwhelming legal philosophical jurisprudence is something called legal positivism, which says the law is just what people who have power impose on other people. It has no necessary relation to morality.
That is a massive shift, in a sense, from moral law being...
Yeah, I do know a little bit about this idea, legal positivism. Again, enough to say that the way that Barry... how do we even explain this? So if you're a legal positivist, you just think that that's the way law is, right? It's an authoritative establishment of norms that's backed by force, right? That's not a moral claim. But I think Barry's interpreting that as a moral claim. Like that it doesn't matter what the law is. It doesn't matter morally what the law is. Because this whole point is that the legal positivist says that laws can be horrifically immoral. The alternative position, I can't remember what it's called. Maybe he was saying this, but it says that there are certain things, and I think that there was a pushback against this in Germany after World War II because of because one of the defenses was, well, look, the horrific things that were done by the Nazis weren't crimes. At least some of them weren't, because they were the law, right? The Nazis made them the law. But then there's this argument, well, there are certain things that cannot be law. It's not just that we think the law was wrong morally. It's that it actually wasn't law because it was so inconsistent with some more fundamental principles, right? So this is an anti-positivistic notion of law. So once again, even my limited knowledge of jurisprudence, Barry's doing a terrible job here, because the point about legal positivism is not to cast a moral judgment on the way the laws are. It's just to say what it is for something to be law has no necessary connection to morality. It doesn't mean that you can't also have moral judgments about what laws are morally good or bad. It just means that that's something that's apart from the question of whether it is a law. So what relevance this has for anything, I don't know. I guess probably in the part that he skipped, he was blaming everything on legal positivism somehow. But that's just a theory about what makes something a law and how laws work. Like it doesn't say anything. It's not a moral theory. Like it just doesn't have any wider implications.
Embedded into the structure of the universe. It's our job to discover it through reason, through experience, through assessment, through reflection, through the tools of science, and then conform laws that line up with that natural law, the way the world is built. So in that view, law is like gravity, right? Gravity exists. We don't make laws. We could make a law to rule out gravity, but it wouldn't change objective reality. It would be foolish and have massive consequences to do so. You're saying that's the shift. We've gone from objective and discovery to subjective and create. And whoever
legal positivism doesn't say that laws are subjective. It says that they are created by authoritative institutions and that there's no necessary connection to morality. People who oppose that say that at least certain things in law cannot be changed by a legislative authority, that there's a necessary connection, at least in some cases, to something at least external to the dictates of that authority. So like the idea would be that certain laws, certain acts of legislation that were enacted by the Nazis were not in fact law because they contravened fundamental principles about human dignity, for example. So the first sentence of the basic law in Germany is that the dignity of humans is inviolable. Right. So the idea from my understanding of the jurisprudence that motivated that is that this statement of German law is not is not interpreted to be something that was created by, like the German Constitution. It's something that is being recognized by the Constitution. It's already the basis of law, right? Again, this is just a view about what law is. It's not a view about what should be the case. The legal positivist, can't speak, positivist thinks that there can be morally horrific laws that are actually laws. Like the person who disagrees with that thinks that beyond a certain threshold that certain things cannot be law because it's impossible to have laws that are that contrary to like human dignity, for example. Like that's the difference. To say that you can't make a moral statement about the status of a law under legal positivism is to completely misunderstand what the theory is saying, which is a bit shocking as a lawyer, I would say, in Barry's case.
As the power, so to speak, gets to create those laws for what reasons they deem being good. If that's the case, this sounds like Nietzsche applied to the law. Is that functionally what you're arguing? And then today, when you're saying unforgetting God, the point is we are culturally and personally untethered from an objective existence, an objective moral norm. And that's what's led to...
Legal positivism does not say that laws are subjective. It says that they're created by legislative authorities.
I think, to quote you, tribalism in politics, lawlessness in our courts, crisis of meaning. Is that a fair summary of your assessment?
That's an incredibly fair summary. And if you trace the trajectory of the Supreme Court, slowly at first, but picking up steam in the 50s and 60s, you can see this. You have the living Constitution project is essentially Holmesian legal positivism in practice. Basically, we don't care what the Constitution says. It's just a bunch of words on a piece of paper. Shouldn't bother us. If we have the power to change.
Yeah, so that's not what again, I don't know very much about jurisprudence, but I do know that is not what the idea of a living constitution says. That there's different ways to understand that. But like, so what you have as a constitution, in some very literalist sense, is a bunch of words on a piece of paper, right? So then the question is, what does that mean legally? And one school of thought says that you try to essentially read the minds of the people who wrote that document and what they meant at the time. So this is, in some sense, an ultimate subjectivity because you're trying to interpret the mental states of people who lived like 300 years ago. That's the notion of original intent, right? Other ideas, I won't try to summarize them in detail because I don't think I could do them justice, but other ideas say that we should use different interpretive principles to understand what the Constitution means and what it says in a contemporary context. Like think about what words mean now rather than what words meant at the time they were used. So here's one example I know from the Australian context. So there's a section in our Constitution, the Australian Constitution, which talked about the federal government having control over, I think it was telegraphic, telephonic, and other like services, right? So if you were to use a rigid original intent argument, which I don't think is very popular in Australia, but maybe I'm wrong about that, you would look at, well, what did the writers of the Constitution mean when they said other like services? They didn't know about like the internet, for example, and therefore the internet would not have been included in that phrase, other like services, and therefore the federal government wouldn't have the power to regulate the internet, right? So that would be one way of understanding how we should interpret the Constitution. A different way, which is the way that our court actually did take, was to look at more about how we should understand that phrase now, other like services. And we would understand internet as being relevantly like telegraphic and telephonic services in terms of what the technology is for and the way that it is used socially, right, and the role in society, and therefore the internet was placed. I think it was the internet, but it doesn't matter for the purpose of the example. It was included under that phrase, other like services, on the basis of that interpretive approach. So, very simple example, just to illustrate the point. This is different ways to understand how we interpret what the Constitution is saying with respect to current issues. So, the view that I think Barry, well, this is maybe a little unfair because he hasn't said this, but he's not very good at being clear about what he actually thinks. If we take the view that we should be entirely focused on original intent, that is an ultimate subjectivity because we're trying to read the minds of dead people, right? Different views use different interpretive principles, including like the usages of words today and their social context and meaning and relevance today. And I personally think that is more relevant, more helpful, and also more objective in some sense because it's easier to point to like acquire evidence about how things are considered, how they're used, how they're treated like today, rather than trying to read the minds of dead people. So like, but even if you disagree with that point, the point is that to say that to use different interpretive principles to what apparently Barry likes is not to say that the Constitution doesn't matter. It's to have a different view about how it should be best interpreted and applied today. If you really think the Constitution didn't matter, you would just literally say we can do whatever we like and pass whatever laws we like. Not that we have to interpret what the Constitution says in the light of, various interpretive principles and see whether whether a particular law holds up against that or not. As a lawyer, Barry should know about this, and I don't understand. It's like it comes back to what I said before. He just is unable to understand the idea that people disagree about, in this case, for example, jurisprudence, like how to interpretive principles for the Constitution or the basis of law. Like they can't just have different views about that. If someone disagrees with Barry about how to approach interpreting the Constitution, it means that they don't care about the Constitution. They don't believe it exists at all or has any relevance. It doesn't mean that they just have different views on how to interpret it. They don't believe in it at all. It's the same thing we saw previously with the other more philosophical issues. If they don't agree with Barry, it's not that they disagree. It's that they don't believe in that thing at all or don't care about it at all. Well, and this is another point as well that you could argue about the consistency of these points, but I won't get into
change that. We will.
Yeah.
And does it matter that the founders, the document that we purport to be interpreting, says something like what we are saying that it says? Doesn't matter to us. It's just about power.
Well, no, but that's not what they say. They're asking what does it say, but they're answering that question in a different way than Barry wants. Like, how do you assess what does something say? Because there's at least two readings, right? I mean, there's many, but you can ask, what did the person who said the thing mean to say? And what did the people who heard the person hear? Like, one way that this can happen is that a person can misspeak, or that they can mean to say one word, but say a different word. But another thing that can happen is that you can use a word one way, but not realize it has a certain connotation or another meaning that then the hearer hears, right? Like a good example of this is sarcasm. You might say something sarcastically. Note that when you say something sarcastically, often you mean the opposite of the literal face value meaning of the words. But if someone doesn't pick up on the sarcasm, they may think that you mean the literal face value of the words that you've said, even though you meant the opposite. So that's just a simple example of where you can have two different meanings of a given utterance. The speaker meaning, the intended meaning, and then the meaning that was perceived by at least one listener. And of course, there are many others as well there's many other things that you can look at to derive an interpretation. But that's a simple example, right? And the point I want to make is you can't just say the meaning simpliciter without any qualifications because there just isn't one. Like there's multiple meanings depending on how you unpack that and what specifics you're talking about. And Barry just wants to pretend that there is just the meaning of the Constitution, devoid of all context or interpretive principles. And then if you don't agree with his view of what that is, then you just don't believe in the Constitution at all. It's the exact same way that fundamentalists think about the Bible, like literalists think about the Bible. There's what the Bible says, just, again, without context, without any interpretive principles. And then if you don't agree with their view of what that is, you don't believe in the Bible. It's unbelievably simplistic in the way that these people seem to think about things. But I mean, there you are. Like Barry he just said that, right? He says that if you don't care about what it says, then you don't care about it at all. No acknowledgement of the idea that people have different frameworks for assessing what the Constitution says. Like that is the point of the disagreement. But he phrases it as caring about what it says and not caring about what it says.
One of the justices were very explicit about this. One of the most famous was William Brennan in his 5-finger rule. He kind of let the cat out of the bag once when he had Nat Hentoff in his office, and he was kind of saying, you know what? When one of my clerks comes into the office, get new ones every term, I would hold up 5 fingers and I wave it like this, and I said, "This is what this court's all about. 5 votes can do anything, whether it's in the Constitution or expressly forbidden by the Constitution. If I can get 5 of my people in this court to say otherwise, that's what the law is."
That's really interesting. In some ways, if you're right.
I don't know the context of that quote, but I'm going to adopt the principle that whenever Barry says something that I can't verify, I'm going to assume that it's false, or at least grossly miscontextualized. But that could be a legal positivist view being expressed, right? That the law is whatever the court decides, which, like in some sense, you sort of can't argue with it, right? Because like the U.S. Supreme Court does make law, so when it makes a decision, that becomes the law. So I don't really know in what sense Barry is trying to say that the justice who said that was wrong. maybe he says the attitude behind it was wrong, but let's not even get to that. Let's just move on.
To concern people on all sides of the aisle that it's reducible to power, and whoever is in power gets to decide it, untethered from moral law. So you're not.
But that's just true, right? Or at least that's what the legal positivist says. Whatever the president, Congress, Supreme Court decide, that becomes the law. They seem to be conflating this with the notion that there's no further moral facts of the matter about whether that was right or wrong morally, which is a completely different issue. All that the legal positivist is saying is whatever Congress, the president, and the Supreme Court do, that is the law. And there's no further fact of the matter about what it is that a law. I mean, I guess there could be disputes if they conflict with each other, but there's no external principles beyond what those authoritative bodies decide, right? That's what the legal positivist is going to be saying. But Barry and Sean seem to think that that means that the legal positivist is denying that you can have any moral principles to evaluate the moral status of those laws. But that's almost the opposite of what the positivists are saying. They're saying that there's different spheres. There's the legal sphere and then there's the moral sphere. You might also happen to be a moral anti-realist if you're a legal positivist, but that's not entailed by the position. Certainly Barry and Sean haven't argued that. They just seem to have no idea what they're talking about. I don't know which, if you mean this guy as Sean or Barry. I don't really care about Barry, but Sean is one of the apologists whose channels that I follow. And I said at the start, as an avowed materialist and someone writing a book on this, I'm certainly interested in Christian apologists who have a fair following, like Sean McDowell does, when they argue that materialism is destroying American culture. So that's why I'm doing a response to this.
Not taking a partisan position here per se. You're making a grander, bigger cultural assessment. Now, let me
just add this.
Dude,
this
please.
is what the entire. So you've heard about originalism in the Supreme Court. Originalism is trying to take the text of the Constitution seriously, and it's a reaction to people like William Brennan who say we can do whatever we want to. We just make it up as we go under this living.
So again, I think that most interpretations treat the Constitution seriously, but they treat it differently. They bring different interpretive principles. It's the same thing with the Bible, by the way. Thinking that the right way to interpret a document is to attempt to analyze the psychological states of the people who wrote it is not the only way that you can take a text seriously.
Constitution Project. Originalism it is no. We are life tenured, unaccountable lawyers who've been placed on this court, and we don't get to tell the rest of the country what our strong policy preferences are under the guise of interpreting the Constitution. We have to take the text of the Constitution seriously, and there's only one way to do that: actually read the text and what it means, and apply that.
I can't believe how naive this guy is. Like in terms of the semantic point that he's made, like the linguistic point, the point about jurisprudence and the political aspects there. Like, well, you just take it seriously. You look at the text and you decide what it says. Like, are you 3 years old? Like, what do you mean decide what it says? Based on what interpretive framework? How are you deciding what it says? What do you mean it says? Like, squiggles on paper don't have inherent meaning. They have meaning in the context of minds bringing a framework to interpret that. And so I'm not saying that there's no fact of the matter about what they mean. I'm not arguing that at all, but I'm saying you need an interpretive framework. You can't just pretend that there's just a straightforward fact of the matter about what a text means that you just look at and see and is somehow objective. I mean, I don't see how you can have anything that's more fundamentally subjective than semantic meaning. Like, it's something that is constructed by minds, right? And used and interacted with by minds. That doesn't mean that there's no objective elements to it. Of course there is, right? That's why we can say that a word is spelled correctly or incorrectly, but that's based on social convention. It's not. Some people might use the term intersubjective. I personally don't like that framing, but whatever. But look, I don't even know why I'm bothering with all this, because Barry doesn't seem to be the slightest bit interested in or cognizant of these issues, and just has an incredibly naive and simplistic way of thinking about jurisprudence and textual interpretation and meta-ethics and philosophy, just like everything. So I don't know why I'm bothering.
Okay, so I just want to put pause on something. Right now, some people are thinking, well, wait a minute, what about, executive orders that Obama gave or Trump has given? I would say put a pause on this. We're not giving a political argument here. We're making a meta point.
Well, I don't know why Sean is saying this, because Barry hasn't, like, maybe he is making a political point. Like, Sean just doesn't want to say it, but like, I don't know the Barry. Anyway.
About the shift in culture over the past 150 years plus. And I want to make sure people think about your thesis before they get to those particulars. But can you connect one dot for me? So lawlessness in our courts makes total sense. If there's no objective standard we're supposed to discover and conform our laws to, crisis of meaning in our culture makes.
the legal positivist says that courts, parliaments, and the executive decide what the law is. Like, I'm trying to get how that means it's lawless. I guess it's lawless if you disagree with that that philosophy of law, right? You don't think that's what law is. That law is not something that is purely and solely made by legislative by authorities, by legal authorities. And so in that sense, you'll say, well, they can make pronouncements, judgments, or pass bills, make executive orders that purport to create law, but don't actually, because there's some higher standards or transcendent standards, whether they're social in nature or I guess God-given or whatever. That's a view that you can have, but it's still not clear that that's lawless. What's happening is that the legislation, the executive orders, the legal judgments don't reflect law. It's not that there is no law. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like the legal positivist says that whatever these authoritative bodies do is law. Other views say that there's other things that matter to determine what the law is as well. But none of these views just say that when a legislative body or a legal authority decides contrary to these other principles, again, like the Nazi Germany example, right? The framers of the German Constitution post-war said that some of the things that the Nazis did were not legal, even at the time, because they contravened fundamental principles about human dignity, right? In that sense, they said that the Nazi regime was disrespectful of the law, and they disobeyed the law, they contravened the law, but it wasn't by them being lawless, it was by pursuing something that was contrary to the law. Like there seems to be a mistake here about what is being said. It's not that there is no law, it's whether the legislative authorities act in accordance with that or not. I don't know, maybe that's just what they mean by lawless, but to me it's like confusing anarchy with bad laws, and that's not really at all what the issue is when it comes to legal positivism. I don't know why I'm having trouble saying that word.
Total sense about this. If there's no God and no afterlife and no objective meaning and purpose because of materialism, I think that's the case. I had a friend of mine on, John Noye, is talking.
What does the afterlife or objective purpose have to do with legal positivity? They've destroyed my ability to say that word for some reason. What does any of that have to do with legal positivism? I just, they don't even try to explain any of these things.
About suicide today. And one deep contributor, if not the primary one, is a loss of meaning and purpose in my life. Materialism obviously can massively contribute to that.
Oh, that sounded like a claim that is empirically testable. So religious or irreligious people more or less likely to kill themselves? I don't know if that's true. Obviously, you need a control for a lot of confounders. But seems like a problematic claim to make without any empirical
basis. But you also talk about...
Camus, the famous existentialist philosopher, said
that
the only serious question in philosophy under existentialism is whether to commit suicide.
That's a profound statement. Now, the one thing you also talk about is tribalism in our politics. I can think of a lot of contributors to why there might be tribalism in our politics. How do you connect the dots from materialism to tribalism in politics?
And so if we are grounding our politics, our ethics as a nation in the transcendent moral norms that have their ultimate grounding in God's existence, there are certain things that are on the table, certain things that are off the table.
Ultimate grounding in God's existence. That sounds a bit like an is claim, Barry. How do you get an ought claim out of that, Barry? What happened to Hume's dictum, Barry? I smell a rat, Barry. What's going on?
Certain window is somewhat collared by those precepts. You can't take the rate of taxation. What's God say about the rate of taxation? Well, we don't know. So I'm not talking about things like that. But is it okay to kill babies? Yeah, that's something that's just off the table. But
hang on, where does God say that? Where does it say that in the Bible? I do know that there are examples not only of God killing babies, but of God ordering other people to kill babies in the Bible. So it seems that if anything, that it's actually okay, at least in some cases, to kill babies. It's like, what are you talking about, Barry? That's probably the worst example he could have chosen, because abortion isn't discussed in the Bible, and in terms of killing babies, there are instances of it being commanded in the Bible. What are you talking about, Barry? Like, has Barry said a single true thing? Or no, there were a couple of things that I agreed on, like the definition of materialism, and then there was his point about the sort of social and political dominance of at least materialist like narratives and approaches to thinking about things in as a result, as I would say, of the Enlightenment. But anyway, so there are a couple of things, but almost everything that he said has been just nonsense. Like that's, I just can't believe he chose that example. Oh dear. Remember when God's existence stopped people from doing these immoral things? Yes. Well, if only we could go back to that, eh?
If you get to a materialist position, I saw Charlie Kirk was debating this kid on a campus just last week. Is it okay? When can we stop killing babies? If we can't stop killing them in their womb, is there any limit? When they're about 2 years old. This kid said that. And so if there is no transcendent moral norm that's governing our relations as a society, politics devolves into a war of all against all. And that is the definition of tribalism. People with competing in.
I don't think a war of all against all is the definition of tribalism, Barry. You know, Barry, I would have said that the definition of tribalism is when people divide into tribes, whether that's like literal or political tribes, and then those tribes, you know, conflict with each other. And that's kind of the opposite of a war of all against all, which is like each individual against each other individual. Like Barry, it seems like tribalism is kind of the opposite of a war of all against all. Maybe the opposite would be no war at all, but it's pretty different at least. So I don't know what you're talking about, Barry, as usual.
Interest, just kind of amalgamate and fight the other tribes. That's.
By the way, have we remembered our everything I don't like soup? Tribalism bad, war of all against all bad. Put those together, you know, they're both bad, so they must be basically the same thing. It's like materialism and New Age. Put them in the pot. Legal positivism, materialism. Put them in the pot. Nietzsche and Hume in the pot. It's just all of these things that are. Oh dear.
Reason that we have such tribalism in our politics today is because nothing is off the table.
You know, I think someone could make the connection from if there's no God, I'm not made in God's image, and which would imply that my identity and my value comes from what God says about me and how he has made me to be. If you get rid of that, then identity is going to be grounded in something else. Maybe it's my.
Well, yeah, so plausibly something intrinsic internal to you and not something from outside. So I personally regard that as an improvement. So your value doesn't come from something outside of you, someone telling you that you're important or somehow making it the case that you're important. No, it's you, the way you are as a human being, for example, as someone with particular wants and desires and interests and so on. That's what makes you important and gives you your identity and moral value, not from, you know, the big man say so, or the big man somehow nature reflected in yours, whatever the hell that means. So I don't understand why Christians think that this is a win for them, because it seems like obviously a downgrade to say that, no, actually your value doesn't come from you. It comes from something outside of you.
My individual feelings. Maybe it is my political party. So in some ways you could argue that if we've lost this transcendent immaterial sense of who and what we are, something's going to fill the void. And tribalism in politics does so. Now, before we move on to the last question,
it's lucky that people who have religion and take it seriously aren't tribal. Because otherwise, if we lost religion, then everyone would start to become super tribal. But you know, with, you know, I guess, let me put it a different way. It's nice to hear that the tribalism never comes or doesn't come as much from people who have strong religious convictions. I'm glad that Sean has seemingly stated that.
Personal note for me is I wish I could say, you know what, when we look outside the church, they're the ones who are tribalistic in politics.
Okay, so he's just realized what he said is actually complete crap. So he's trying to argue that tribalism comes from trying to fill a void that comes from rejecting God. But then he's realized that's just obvious nonsense. That religious fundamentalists are some of the most tribalistic people, not just in the West, but in every society. You look in Muslim countries, you look in India, you know, Hindu countries. You even see this in Buddhist countries, though. There's reasons why that's a bit less so. But the point is, like, even he can't say that with a straight face. He was literally laughing to himself. Yeah, that's actually kind of nonsense. So now he's going to backpedal on that point.
We in the church are not, practically speaking, that just is not true. We have bought lock, stock, and barrel into identity and politics and not dealt with that well within the church and become tribalistic, sadly. So I just don't want this podcast to pick on those out.
So in other words, what Sean just said is complete tosh about tribalism coming from rejection of God. So we should just ignore that completely. I agree, Sean. I agree with you just fundamentally rejecting what you said only 30 seconds ago. Great move.
Without reflecting inside and going, we have a serious issue inside first. But that's a topic for another conversation.
Well, I mean, it could be a topic for this conversation, though.
You have a term you call cut flower culture. Tell us what you mean by that term and why you think America is a cut flower culture.
So cut flower culture, Will Herbert coined this phrase. And basically, it's Consider the flowers that you get from the florist. They're beautiful, right? You stick them in water, and for a few days, they're just gorgeous. But ultimately, they've been cut off from their source of sustenance, the ground and the minerals and the water that gave them life, and they wilt and die. Cultures are the same way in this sense, that if you cut American culture, or the Western culture more generally, off from its Judeo-Christian roots, can you hope to sustain the beauty of the Western cultural project, incorporated in particular in the Declaration of Independence, in the absence of the Judeo-Christian worldview upon which that was rooted and grounded? And the answer is probably not. And if for example, John David Danielson just wrote us this book called Pagan America, in which he says, as the influence of Christianity, and it's particularly this idea that we're all made in the image of God, recede.
I have never in my entire life heard a Christian who uses this phrase, made in the image of God, explain what that means. I think the closest I've got is to say, well, God is has a rational mind, and he made us with rational minds as well. The problem with that is, of course, it then sounds like what's important is having a rational mind, and not so much whether God happens to have one as well. So the whole image thing doesn't seem to be important there. What's important is the intrinsic characteristics of, you as a person with a mind. Anyway, the point that I'm making there is that this notion of being made in the image of God has absolutely no explanatory worth at all, because it's never defined. And when it is, you can just appeal to whatever it is that constitutes being made in the image of God as being the ground that you need for whatever it is you think it, like for morality or for a society or whatever. Just appeal to those properties or characteristics or virtues or whatever. It's the same problem that theists face when explaining why God is supposed to be a good ground of morality. They'll say, well, it's God's nature that grounds moral goodness. Then you ask, well, but what about God's nature? What characteristics? God has many characteristics. Being immaterial plausibly is not a moral characteristic, nor is being all powerful. So you kind of need to specify what you mean there. What about God's nature constitutes the ground of value? And then people like Craig will start listing virtues, like loving and beneficent and caring and all these other things. But of course, then you're just saying that those things ground moral value. And so we don't need God. At best, God could tell us more about those virtues, but the virtues themselves are doing the grounding work there. They're constituting what makes something good. And so it's the same here. The notion of being made in the image of God is an absolute, a complete red herring. It has nothing to do with anything at all when it comes to actually providing a justification or a ground for social action or for laws or anything like that. But it's very useful apologetically, because it sounds nice and it's a phrase that Christians are familiar with, but it's also one you don't actually have to explain, and no one bothers to actually articulate what this is supposed to mean, that's relevant to the context here, and that then doesn't invite the naturalist to say, well, can't we just appeal to that thing? Like if rationality is important, then appeal to that, or if being conscious is important, then just appeal to that, right? It really annoys me because of this. Because of the just complete explanatory emptiness that it has. Of course, theism in general is like that. But anyway, back to the point. So Barry is telling us that Western civilization has been shorn of its Judeo-Christian roots. So I think Barry's absolutely right. And Western civilization has been going downhill ever since it was shorn from its original roots, which we all know, of course, was the traditional religion of the Greco-Roman society, the pagan religion of the gods of the pantheon, the Roman and the Greek pantheons. And it was the triumph of Christianity in the 4th century because of the political actions of Constantine and his dynasty, which saw the stem and the root system that grounded Western civilization be lopped off from the branches that were growing above, and which then withered and died, and we saw the collapse of the Roman Empire and the collapse of learning and the almost eclipse of writings in North and Western Europe for many centuries. So I completely agree with Barry. We really need to be careful about going back to our roots of Western civilization.
What's coming to take its place? Well, the idea that the weak should not be oppressed, that women have value, that children have value, that we should not enslave people,
women have equal value and we should not enslave people. Famously, both ideas that are not expressed in the Bible.
Strong should not just dominate the weak. That's second nature to Christians. To the Greeks and Romans, from which Christianity sprung, it would have been totally alien. And his thesis.
The introduction of Greek thought into the Roman religious tradition brought about the collapse. So this is a super based take. It's the corrupt influence of the Greeks. We need to go back to the true Roman roots of the Roman Republic. This is what was this guy? The guy who said Carthage must be destroyed. That was Plato the Elder, right? Pretty sure that was Plato the Elder. Cato the Elder, not Plato the Elder. Yeah, Cato the Elder. Yeah, no. So that is a very based conservative Roman take. We've got to go back to the roots.
So his book is what we're seeing as Christianity recedes. This idea that the strong oppress the weak is coming back to the fore.
The idea of cut flowers is
yes, and the strong oppressing the weak is famously something that never happened throughout the centuries of domination of Western polities by religious, well, not just religious people, but like expressly ecclesiastical authorities. So well done there, Barry, in identifying what was really important in preventing that sort of horrible outcome through centuries of Christian domination.
really interesting that a flower can maintain its beauty for a while, but only so long without its source. And the question is, if there's certain ideas that are unique to the Judeo-Christian tradition, which doesn't imply that we were a Christian nation, that is a separate issue, but philosophically, the idea of human rights, which are not material things, the idea of equality, which is not a material thing, these are rooted.
Equality is not a material thing. Well, equality just means two quantities are the same or have the same value. I suppose we could start talking about abstract objects, but quantities, if we think of them as measurable properties of the physical world, how are they not a physical thing? Like, obviously, when we're talking about equality, we're actually talking about something very specific, which is equal treatment under the law. And that's a very physical thing. So, like, what are you talking about, Sean? What do you mean it's not material? I don't even know what, like, it's not that hard to think about these things for 3 seconds and realize that you're talking about absolute rot. Like, equality is not a material thing. Well, what do you mean it's not a material thing? Like, maybe you could say, like, the concept of equality is not material. Well, it depends how you think about it, right? You might think that there are sort of abstract objects that we refer to when talking about these abstractions. I mean, I don't believe in that, but you could make that argument. Not clear how that's an argument for God, by the way. William Lane Craig famously has tried to argue against Platonism and abstract objects as a potential threat to God's sovereignty, right, and necessary self-existence. So I don't know how appealing to abstract objects is really helping you here, if that's what Sean wants to do. But I would say that concepts are ultimately grounded in human mental activity and social relations and so forth, so they are material. But if we're looking at equality in a more specific social political context, it's very clear what that means. It's equal treatment under the law, which was interestingly something that was not practiced for centuries under political systems dominated by religious ideas and religious courts and religious laws, which had different laws that applied to different social classes in society. And, if you know anything about the French Revolution, remember the three estates, right? There was the clergy, there was the nobles, and then everyone else. And the reason for that was because the different laws applied in these three cases, right? You had the laws and penalties that applied to nobility, those that applied to the clergy, and those that applied to everyone else. That's why you had the three estates. This was the way they thought about the structure of society. It was very hierarchical and very much not in accordance with ideas that we would have about legal equality between persons. The idea of one person, one vote, again, just was anathema. They had the three estates, each of which had the same number of votes in the assembly, because it wasn't one person, one vote. It was like one estate, one vote. Anyway, like, without getting into all those details, I'm just explaining how the ideas that Sean says are not material are, like, you can understand very specifically and materially what they are referring to, like equality here. But also, it's not at all clear that that equality has like Christian and antecedents. I mean, obviously, there's certain ideas that you can appeal to, like being equal before God. That is an idea that was prominent throughout the Middle Ages, but that wasn't an idea that was held to apply here in our earthly realm. Society was very hierarchical. At the end of everything, everyone would go to meet their maker and would be judged before God as an individual. That's true, but that wasn't thought to hold sway in terms of how we should structure society in this world. So as a political philosophy, that wasn't influential for centuries under Christian society. And I would argue it was the Enlightenment which led to a change in these views. The Enlightenment, which was fundamentally a secularizing, rationalizing project that was in opposition, not necessarily to theism as such, because many Enlightenment thinkers were deists, but it was absolutely in opposition to conservative religious ideas to clergy and to religious dogma and superstition. So I think that Sean is from a philosophical and historical point of view, is just completely off on this point about, equality is not material.
In our Constitution, not practiced, that's for sure, but built into the Constitution. Can we maintain those rights and values if we cut off its source? That seems to be the heart of what you're asking.
Sean, explain to me how the source of that is in the Bible. Like, where in the Bible does it say that there should be equality under the law? Like, yes, it does say, the Bible talks about how everyone is judged by God, right? And there are principles you can appeal to there. But like, that's a theological point. That's not a political point. Where does it say that we should have equality under the law and equal treatment of everyone on the basis of the offense that they commit rather than on their social standing, which was practiced for centuries under Christian-dominated societies? Like, where does that come from in the Bible? Why was that not practiced for centuries under Christian rule? Why is it only after the Enlightenment that we started to see that principle being argued for and defended, like the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Code and things like that? I think that if you look historically at this, you don't get anything like what Sean is saying.
And you're wrestling with, maybe clarify for us, because I think right away some people are thinking, okay, this guy is a disguised Christian nationalist. Now that term is so, I think, equivocal and ambiguous, and I don't.
Oh, well, it's lucky we haven't been using any equivocal or ambiguous words so far in this conversation, because that would kind of muddy the waters a bit, wouldn't it? Oh dear.
I've had at least 3 conversations and debates on that, on people for and against, on my YouTube channel. But what exactly are you arguing? Since you're a lawyer,
I too love to debate fascists on my YouTube channel.
Saying we need laws now that reflect the Bible. Is this a disguised form of Christian nationalism? Maybe clarify that for us.
So nowhere in the book do I say that we need laws that reflect the Bible, but I do think that we have to have an underlying presupposition that rights talk is real. And let me tell you what I mean by that. If you're a materialist, and the overwhelming majority, I believe, in our intelligentsia, the people who are running the heights of our cultures and the law and the media, for example, academia, if they're at least functional materialists, if not out and out confessing materialists. And so this all came to the fore, speaking of Christian nationalism, I write about this in the book, in an interview I saw with Heidi Pritzbala about a year ago. And she was sounding the warning klaxon against Christian nationalists. And the interviewer, I think this was on MSNBC, said, well, what's this Christian nationalist? Who are these people? And she said, well, Christian nationalists are people who believe our rights come from God instead of the Supreme Court or Congress. And so you got to be careful for those people. And I thought to myself, and she caused kind of a firestorm of controversy because, well, if that's the case, our founders were Christian nationalists, because that's what they believe. That's what the Declaration says.
Hang on.
Because instead of the Supreme Court or Congress, nationalists. Who are these people? And she said, well, Christian nationalists are people who believe our rights come from God instead of the Supreme Court or Congress. And so you got to be careful for those people. And I thought,
well, that's obviously silly because, again, the principle of uncharity that we established before, if Barry says something, don't believe it. But so I don't know if this person said that thing, but that's obviously a dumb thing to say, because someone who believes that law comes from God is not necessarily a Christian. I mean, for a start, they could be a Muslim, or they could be a Hindu, or they could just be a deist, like many of the founding fathers were. So that has no necessary connection to being a Christian at all. So if that's the definition of Christian nationalism given, it's a silly one. I'm not going to get into that now about how to define it. That's not really my interest here. I thought we were talking about materialism, but yeah, it's interesting that Barry is now selectively interested in giving clear and more charitable definitions of loaded terms like this. It's a shame we didn't apply that 40 minutes ago.
And she caused kind of a firestorm of controversy because, well, if that's the case, our founders were Christian nationalists, because that's what they believe. That's what the Declaration says. And Pritzbala had not really thought this through. Because what does it mean to have a right, Sean? To have a right means that you are treated in the way that you ought to be treated in a just way by the government. Well, that has meaning only if ought and just have objective meaning. And that has objective meaning only if God exists. And so we...
yeah, I mean, I've talked about this at length. So sure, Barry, yeah, it's just the same thing that we've been seeing throughout. Barry thinks that the only way that you can believe in human rights is to believe in them in exactly the way that he understands them. If you don't agree with the way he understands them, it means you don't believe in them at all. It's the same thing when it comes to the Constitution. It's the same thing when it comes to human rights. It's the same thing when I just said human rights. It's the same thing when it comes to morality, rather. And it's the same thing when it comes to free will, though that was only just mentioned briefly. But like, it's all of these same things. If you don't understand them in exactly the way he does, or close enough to the way he does, you don't believe in them at all. There's no scope here for like differing opinions or interpretations that you can then marshal arguments for and against, right? Which is, I would say, what philosophy or just inference is about, like discussion. It's just embarrassing. Like, these people just don't know how to do think, how to discuss, how to evaluate ideas. It's just what they think, or you don't believe in anything.
As Christians, as theists generally, Martin Luther King Jr., as a matter of fact, appealed to this natural rights theory in his letter from the Birmingham jail. He says, a law that transcends God's law is no law at all. And he quoted Augustine and Aquinas for that. Well, what's the alternative? Well, again, you go back to positivism, legal positivism. Only the government grants your rights. Well, the government grants your rights and take them away. And the ultimate expression of that in our time was Nazi Germany. Did you know the Holocaust was not illegal? It was not illegal in the sense that it did not violate any of the internal laws of Germany at the time. And so the Germans said, you know, the Jews have no right to life. And we are the ones who say what rights are, and we're taking that one away. Well, I don't think that's the place we want to go.
No, I don't think Hitler
Oh, hang on.
was a materialist. But you're
Yes. Well, thanks, Sean, for having at least a shred of integrity here. There's many other things he did not challenge in the discussion, or ideas that he advanced which are completely indefensible, but at least he's highlighting this point here that Hitler absolutely was not a materialist. And Nazi philosophy, I think, is pretty incomprehensible under materialism. But this point that I mentioned before, that again, it shows that Barry just has no idea what legal positivism is, because it's precisely this idea that it's interesting he now makes this analogy. I mentioned this earlier before I'd seen this, but that the framers of the German Constitution after the Second World War were precisely driven, or many at least, driven to this anti-positivistic view of law, because they were horrified at what was done under the Nazis, under the guise of legality. By the way, not everything, many things that the Nazis did were actually illegal, even in the context of the law, like, well, Action T4, for example, it would be an example of this, which you can look at, but also a lot of the actions of the Holocaust were done in other countries, which violated laws, which violated international treaties that Germany had signed previously about treatments of prisoners of war and occupied territories and things like that. So what Barry says, even under that strict sense, is not quite true. But anyway, the framers of the new German Constitution, the Basic Law, mindful of this, had approached it in an explicitly anti-positivistic way. And, you know, that this initial principle, as I said before, that human dignity is inviolable, and the idea then being that what the Nazis did, even if they purported to be legal, and if they sort of attempted to pass legislation or pronouncements that declared that something was now legal, in fact, failed to do that, because certain things cannot be made legal, or certain laws cannot be altered by legal authorities, because there is a basis of law that's outside purely the pronouncements of or decisions of legal authorities. Again, that's the anti-positivistic view about law. Barry doesn't seem to understand this, and therefore is conflating being a positivist about law with thinking that, with essentially being a moral nihilist, and thinking that there is no objective basis for moral critique of what the law is. It's also, even if you are both a moral nihilist and a legal realist, so even if you grant those premises, it's not at all clear what that has to do with Nazi Germany. Like, why would you think that specifically is the outcome that you get? Why not something completely different? It's like the Columbine example. Again, why do we think that specifically leads to that outcome? Again, just like the Columbine example, Nazi Germany didn't really end very well for its perpetrators, right? So why do we think that this is just sort of obviously where you would end up acting in accordance with materialist assumptions? Not that Hitler even had materialist assumptions. Again, you see how the shtick works, right? It's grab a whole bunch of things that we don't like, or we think that our audience, Christian influenced audience, is not going to like. Nazi Germany, legal positivism, moral nihilism, Nietzsche, mix them all together in our big pot and serve that up as like, see, this is what you get under materialism, even though really none of these things have any particular connection to each other, and nor is it explained how they're supposed to like lead to each other, or be interconnected, or simultaneously even be possible. It's just frustrating to have such a slipshod job done of many of these issues that I care a lot about, like, you know, philosophy and history, especially Nazi Germany. It's a particular interest of mine, and just a complete inability to discuss those in a thoughtful way. But we did at least have a pushback from Sean here, so let's see what he says.
Saying this view of law follows from a materialist understanding of the law. And I think the point that you're making, just want to clarify, is that if somebody defines Christian nationalism as someone who thinks our rights,
so we're just going to change the subject, right? So Barry gives, I mean, he's done this multiple times before, like when he was mentioning abortion, which is not condemned in the Bible. And then when he, there was another example as well. Oh yeah, when he was talking about the rise of New Ageism and then trying to blame that on materialism. Now he's trying to blame the Third Reich on materialism, or that seems to be what he was saying, even though Hitler obviously was not a materialist. Barry just doesn't have any ability to understand differences of views, like differences between views that he doesn't agree with. They're all the same to him. They're all just bad things that are wrong and that fundamentally reject, human rights and morality and things like this. He can't understand how they are different from different interpretations of things or different theories for things and what he says, and also simultaneously different from each other.
God.
So Shaw's
then
trying to
you're
cover this
guilty,
up by
I'm
bringing
guilty,
it back to
the framers
Christian
were guilty of being
naturalism.
Christian nationalists.
Nationalism.
The positive about that is if our rights come from God and not the law, then the laws are supposed to reflect the inherent right that I have. I have a right to freedom of religion. I have a right.
But what Sean says there's not even correct. So under natural law theory, rights come from the law. They don't come directly from God. They come from the law. Now, the law may be the law. Well, I mean, I don't. So Barry mentioned Thomas Aquinas before, so I don't know if they're appealing to that. But like the idea is that God doesn't separately God doesn't create the world and then imbue it with moral order. God imbues it with moral order in the act of creating it. That might be one way to frame this, right? So this is not a divine command theory view of morality. The idea is that there is moral order, moral principles imbued in the nature of the way the world is. And the thing is that the materialist can actually agree with a lot of this. They just disagree with where it came from. But if you think, for example, that the nature of a human being as a rational animal who has preferences and desires and can feel pain and pleasure is what makes them have moral significance, then the natural law theorist and the materialist can agree on that point, right? It doesn't, in that sense, matter where those things came from. The divine command theorist, the theological voluntarist, actually disagrees with that. They say, no, there's no moral order inherent to the creation. Like creation sans God, right? At least the physical part of creation. God, in some sense, inserts that, creates that separately when he gives his commandments. That's at least the sort of traditional theological voluntarist view. Actually, a lot of apologists are backing away from that these days, it seems. But the point is, if you reject legal positivism and appeal to some sort of natural law, then you don't think that God gives those laws somehow like separately from creation. They're imbued, they're contained within creation, and we can actually look at creation and find what those laws are without even necessarily knowing anything about God. This is what differentiates like the natural law theory from the divine command theory, because the divine command theory says the only way we know what's good and bad is to listen to what God has told us. Maybe we can introspect on our conscience, which God also gave us, but like we could go wrong there because we also have corrupt nature. So you really want to focus on God's explicit commandments, right, to keep us down the right path. Whereas the natural law theory says we can actually look at creation and see what properties it has, and using reason to infer what are the good and the bad things. And then the thing is that the materialists can make a very similar type of argument as well, that they don't think that creation is like divinely ordered, but you can still identify the properties and structures that exist in nature and then ground a morality on the basis of that, like on the basis of human well-being, for example. And that would be the basis on which you would say that the legislated laws or the laws as attempted to be passed, that laws as the authorities attempt to create them are in fact inconsistent with the natural laws. But Sean seems to be a bit confused about that. He seems to be saying legal positivism is wrong, but at the same time, the laws are wrong. Like he's saying legal positivism is wrong, but at the same time, we should condemn the law because it's morally bad. But if you disagree with legal positivism, you don't just think that the law is morally bad. In fact, you can't think that. The whole point of those people who oppose legal positivism is that they think that sufficiently immoral laws, like those that contravene human rights, for example, they're not actually laws. Like that's the whole point. It's not that you have a moral judgment of the law. You think it's not actually the law, at least in some cases, right? The actual law will be in accordance with the with whatever the natural law. Like the way that Aristotle thought about it, for example. So I don't think that Sean appreciates this distinction here.
right to free speech. Those are inherent in being human. So that didn't come from the law. So the law cannot.
If it's inherently being human, then it doesn't require God to ground it. It only requires facts about humans to ground it. Again, Sean doesn't seem to appreciate this point. If something's inherent in being human, maybe that's an appeal to natural law and an argument against positivism, but it's not an argument for theism. That's an argument for humanism, actually.
Take those away. Get rid of God.
Government.
So that didn't come from the law. So the law cannot take those away. Get
Rid
rid of God.
Government. So the government can't take those away.
Through the laws, yes.
No, that's not. So what Barry said is wrong. It's not just that the government can take them away. It's literally that the law can't take them away, because it's impossible to make law that contravenes human rights. It's not actually law. That would be the anti-positivist argument. If you're a positivist, you would just say, yeah, the law can do that, but it shouldn't do that. Again, Barry doesn't seem to appreciate that. They don't understand anything about what they're talking about. Not that I'm an expert on these matters, but like...
Thank you. Good clarification. So that's really helpful. Typically, the concern with Christian nationalism is when somebody starts to argue, for example, that America is a favored nation, like Israel was a favored nation, and the promises to Israel apply uniquely to the United States. That's where theologically, even Christians say, pause, time out, that's going too far. That's one of the areas of concern. But you say you're not arguing for that.
You don't believe that.
Yeah, you don't believe that. Okay, good. Yeah. I just want to clarify. Let me unpack a couple things that you say. So it's like the second half of your book, or maybe the last third, is really an apologetics book. So you're kind of critiquing culture that it's forgotten God. And your solution is, you actually say to be more skeptical about materialism.
Am I a moral anti-realist? No, I'm a moral realist. I've defended that many times and talked about it quite a lot. But I mean, the point that I'm making here is that you can be an anti-realist or a realist under materialism. It's not determined by the position, contrary to what Barry and Sean have been saying, although they haven't actually given an argument for their view. They've just asserted it many times. It's so funny to see how Sean selectively agrees with Barry, but then when Barry says something that he thinks it's not defensible or doesn't make sense, like the point about Hitler being a materialist, or when Barry implied that, Sean will subtly walk it back and then change the topic. He did that a number of times. Yeah, it's just... so dishonest.
And that the evidence is that God exists. So this is more of a personal project for people to ask the question, do I believe in God and why? Kind of a bottom-up one, rather than a top-down political movement that you're calling for. That's the way that I read it. You have a...
Well, that's interesting. That's the way that Sean reads it. Sean's done this many times. He's told Barry what Barry is arguing for. He hasn't asked Barry these. He says, oh, but you're not arguing for Christian nationalism. You're not making partisan political points. Remember, he mentioned that earlier. He doesn't ask Barry what he says. My hypothesis is that if he did ask Barry what Barry really thought, Barry would say a bunch of things that Sean would feel uncomfortable being aired to his audience. And so Sean's just subtly, not so subtly, guiding Barry about what he wants him to be saying here, which is a little bit sad, really.
Provocative line in your book. You say materialists have to believe crazy things. Now, Barry, Christians believe crazy things. We believe that donkeys talk and dead people rise from the grave. So is this just true for both, or you think materialists believe crazier things?
So this section of the book, Materialists Believe Crazy Things, comes from my friend Granville Sewell, who is a professor at UTEP. And he writes that if you're a materialist, you have to believe that the fundamental forces of the universe operating on the fundamental particles spontaneously rearrange such that we now have airplanes and nuclear power plants and Apple iPhones and computers, because that's the only creative power that materialists are allowed to have, right? The fundamental particles being manipulated by the fundamental forces. I say that that's crazy because blind, undirected forces demonstrably do not have the creative power to result in the observed effect. That's why that's crazy.
I think Barry needs to go back to school and learn how to construct an argument. Okay, so let's hear his argument against materialism. Well, let's restate it. He said that materialists think that blind, undirected forces gave rise to, airplanes and other things. But that's crazy because blind, undirected forces demonstrably cannot give rise to those things. Okay, but Barry, that's what materialists think. Like, you've just said that materialists are wrong because you disagree with their conclusion. We sort of need an argument there, Barry, like some sort of set of premises and a conclusion, or, there's different ways to structure an argument, but what you can't do is just assert the thing, just declare, this is what my opponents think, and it's wrong because I don't agree with what my opponents think. That's literally what he just did there. He just asserted what an implication of materialist worldview, and then said it's wrong because it's just obvious that it's wrong. Not very convincing, Barry. Like, can we have a bit more of an argument as to why that's not possible? Now, of course, he did frame it in a very, I think, misleading way. Materialists don't say that it was spontaneous in a sense of just anything can happen. There's obviously very particular natural laws that operate, and we can explain many steps of the process through scientific inference and discoveries, by the way, and nothing to do with anything that religion has provided, because religion is useless for understanding anything about how the world works. It all comes through scientific reasoning and making the assumption that things happen through mechanistic forces and processes rather than through divine intervention. Because if you assume that everything that happens is due to divine interventions or magical forces or some supernatural forces, you actually cannot explain anything, because anything could happen at any time. Now, everything becomes inexplicable. So methodological naturalism, at the very least, is essential for scientific progress. And I would argue that that points us to a metaphysical naturalism. But yeah, just not really much of an argument there, Barry. Barry's just asserted that a consequence of materialism is absurd because he doesn't agree that it is plausible without any explanation. Fair point. He didn't say that they're wrong. He said they're crazy.
You just can't get to that staggering specified complexity through a blind process. Now, are the miracles of the Bible crazy in the same way? No, they're not. Absolutely not. Because the miracles of the Bible are attributed to a God who uses those miracles to accomplish his purposes. Well, Barry said that just...
What are his purposes, Barry? He could have any purposes. Apparently, that could include like flooding the whole world and telling a man to kill his son. And like all of the other things that are crazy, stupid things that are in the Bible. So like they are crazy because there's no way to rationalize them that we can understand. It could just be, well, God's ways are mysterious ways. That's crazy, Barry. Like that's a stupid way to try to understand anything.
That just pushes the question back to,
yes,
does God exist? Well,
no. It doesn't push the question back to, does God exist? It pushes the question, because we're assuming that as part of the explanation, it pushes the question back to, what would God do? What would his reasons be for saying this versus that, when we're trying to make an explanation or a prediction for things that happen in the world. And this is the problem, that theists have no answer to this question as to, well, why would God do this or that, or what are his reasons? Or when they do have answers, the answers are incredibly unconvincing.
Certainly, the cause that is posited can account for the effect that is observed, and therefore it's not crazy to believe that that cause can create that effect. It's a different question where God does he exist? And of course, there's
Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't blame Barry too much for this, because very few theists seem to understand this point. But the saying that God is capable of bringing about a certain effect does not thereby explain that effect. It only explains it if you combine God's capability, which, remember, God has all possible capabilities, so that doesn't actually get you very far. You need to combine that with an intention or a reason or a desire or something of that sort. And that's what theists can almost never do. Again, they sometimes try to come up with something, but in most cases, they can't say anything, because they don't know what God's purposes are. We don't have a divine psychology, at least not in any detailed sense. So you never actually can get into any explanatory depth with these theistic explanations, and that's why they're not sufficient to account for the effects, because merely determining that something is possible under a worldview is not to explain it under that worldview. I guess he thinks that creation is impossible under naturalism, but it's actually not. I mean, even creationists acknowledge this. It's not actually impossible. It's just extremely unlikely that blind forces would lead to all these, specified complexity and things like that. It sounds like he's been reading some intelligent design by the use of that term, because intelligent design and creationists are the only people who use that term that I know of. But at any rate, the point is that they even acknowledge that it's possible under materialism, just extraordinarily unlikely, and that's what makes it crazy. But the thing is that the mere possibility is not sufficient for explanations under naturalism. Under materialism, you need to have some sufficient plausibility established. I agree with that, but they don't apply that criteria to their own worldview. They say, well, it's possible that God could have done this because he's all powerful, but then they completely neglect to assess how plausible is it that God would have that right sort of motivation to do that thing compared to all the other things he could have done. They just do not care about this. Seriously, whenever I raise this point, there's just indifference. There's, well, I don't know, God could do lots of things, like that. They just don't see that as an issue. Like, well, why does it matter to ask about what other things God could have done? He just chose to do this particular thing, and that's all there is to it. Baffling to me. I don't understand how people can be so narrow-minded in the way they think about things, that, well, naturalists need to explain why this outcome and not others, but theists don't need to. All they need to establish is God could have done that, and God could do anything. So therefore, we've explained everything that happens. Completely baffling to me, but apparently Barry thinks that that's good enough for an explanation.
Overwhelming evidence that he does exist. And as you pointed out in a recent debate, you actually have to prove that God doesn't exist in order to say that miracles are crazy or are not possible.
That was a debate I had at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, a conversation with a wonderful professor, Paul Rinsler, who's an atheist there. It was a great conversation that we had. So I agree with your assessment here. The bigger questions are, can you get life from non-life?
Why are we even talking about this?
Consciousness from matter. There's no naturalistic explanation for any of those phenomena.
Wrong on all three counts, but I'm too tired to get into those details. So, okay, what would actually be nice is if we had Sean say, okay, look, life from non-life. It's interesting. A lot of the apologists are backing away from the abiogenesis point, because we do increasingly understand that. But apparently Sean still wants to push that one. So let's take that as an example. We say, look, here's what scientists say about how abiogenesis occurred, and here's what are the problems. And here's the explanation that theists have, and why it's a better explanation. Of course, the explanation is God done it, and there's no explanation as to why God made life from non-life, in particular why he made embodied physical life with, with carbon biochemistry. Like, why is that a thing that God would do of all the things he could do? But anyway, but that's a bit of effort, right? And so we're not going to bother with that. We're just going to assert that you can't explain how life came from non-life. And by the way, even if you couldn't explain that under materialism, it's only really relevant if theism can provide a better explanation. And of course they can't. Their explanation is God done it. And if you ask why, they don't have any credible answers. The answer is all platitudes. Nathan and I have talked about this, for example, when we reviewed the book by Richard Swinburne, Is There a God? I think it's called. And he's one of the few that's actually tried to provide some answers for these sorts of things. And his answers are a joke. It's just a bunch of platitudes. Well, it seems reasonable that God would want to do this because I think that's good. And so therefore God would have a reason to do it. And just, anyway, can't get into all those details here, but most don't even bother with that. So what we get is a shifting the goalposts, right? The goalposts are here for when it comes for what a materialist has to explain, but then when you ask for an explanation from the theists, the goalposts are moved to the other side of the solar system, right? It's no, we don't have to explain any of those things. We just have to say how it's possible under theism, and that's good enough. And, likewise for things, what are the other things you mentioned as well? How do you get something from nothing? Well, the theist answer for this is a classic. Well, God just always existed necessarily. Okay, well, as Graham Oppie points out, the atheist or materialist can just say the same thing about the universe or some sort of antecedent to the universe. It just existed necessarily always. It's like, wow, that was easy. I just made something from nothing. I just declared that it existed necessarily. What a profound intellectual enterprise we've engaged in there. So that's not much of an argument. And what was the other one? Consciousness. Well, I've got a lot to say about that, but let's move on from that. And of course, the theists have no explanation for that either. They just say, well, just God is conscious. End of story.
And yet we know,
right?
Yeah, and we know intelligent minds can create these kinds of phenomena. So it's not a God of the gaps. It's a recognition that there's no naturalistic explanation, but these have the signs of intelligence. So if there is a God who's created the universe.
Notice how Sean explicitly endorsed the capability equates to explanation point that I was making. God can do these things, so therefore that amounts to explaining them. If the same criteria was applied to naturalism, then we would have maybe, I guess you could argue about the consciousness point, because a lot of people do say that it's actually impossible. But certainly the origin of life and the origin of order and complexity and things like that are all, even if you just ignore everything that we have to say about those things, they're all possible. It's just extremely unlikely. Anyway.
Created life from non-life and made a donkey. It's actually not crazy that God could choose to use a donkey to talk. On its
see, look, he just explicitly endorses this. It's not crazy that God could do this. But that's not the problem, Sean. Why would he do that? Of all the things he could do, why that? That's what an explanation is supposed to do. It's supposed to tell you, it's supposed to rationalize why an outcome as distinct from all the other possibilities, in that context. And that's the very problem that theists have with materialists, because there seems to be this highly specified outcome of all the range of possibilities that are consistent with the materialist presupposition. And so the theists want to know, why do we see this one? It seems pretty unlikely that we'd get that. Just like that if you went to a casino and rolled a 6 10 times in a row, you might wonder, why did I get this outcome? Seems a little unlikely. Maybe there's something going on. Maybe the dice are loaded. Maybe something's happening there, and that wouldn't be an unreasonable thing to infer, to question, right? And so, it just seems it seems to me that it's a blatant double standard is applied. That when there are many possible outcomes under materialism, and the ones that are observed are sort of special in some way or unexpected, right? Then an explanation is demanded as to why these particular outcomes are observed. But then when the same thing happens with respect to theism, like God uses a donkey to talk instead of all of the other things he could have done, which, by the way, there's always more options for God than materialism, because God's not can use any material means plus any other means, like any non-material means that you can imagine. That's possible, logically possible. Then there's simply no requirement to give an explanation. If it's enough that God could use that means. Now, if this is the standard you apply, then you should reason that everything that happens is specifically an intervention by God, right? Because that's always going to be the best explanation. If all you need to establish is that God could do something, well, he could do anything that's logically possible. So anything that we observe should be inferred by this logic to be a direct intervention by God. I don't see how you avoid that inference if this is actually the principles that you apply. Now, of course, no one does apply this consistently. It's only because it's so ridiculous, right? And it's completely useless as an inference principle. It doesn't get you anywhere. You don't learn anything about anything because you just rationalize any particular outcome as, well, God wanted that, so he did it, right? He could do it. I mean, you can't say he couldn't do it. He's all powerful, so he must have done it. That's the best explanation. After all, anything else is going to be less probable than that, because you're going to have to invoke, mechanisms that we may or may not know exist, right? If you're trying to invoke a naturalistic explanation, whereas God definitely could do it. If you postulate God's existence, that's all you need. You need God's existence, then he could do anything. Therefore, everything is explained, all wrapped up nicely in a bow. No one actually applies that. Like if we applied that principle in science, we would get absolutely nowhere. So the fact that we need methodological naturalism, not just in science, but in the legal system and elsewhere as well, is, I think, pretty clear evidence that this method of trying to understand the world is totally useless and intellectually bankrupt. But and that's why it's only applied inconsistently to areas that are sort of rhetorically useful for apologists to make a point, like about the mind or the origin of the universe and things like this, or morality as well. And never about practical issues where it's sort of much more easy to demonstrate that making inferences in accordance with the principles that Sean is espousing here would just be completely useless. Yes, and this is essentially what I'm saying. Like, if you take this sort of empirical approach here, every appearance is God communicating with us in that specific act, right? I don't see what's wrong with that inference. It seems that follows from what Sean is saying, and it's unclear how you get any sort of scientific reasoning if that's the approach you take.
Surface, it seems crazy, but if we deal with the first questions first, it's really not. God will not be limited by this. So the way you frame it, I would agree with that. Let me ask you this question. So I've been. In some ways, there's a couple things at play. There's the evidence that we make for the existence of God. And I think the case is strong and convincing for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. That's my assessment of it. I know you agree. But one of the reasons we have such a lack, those arguments don't often land, is in the church, we just have so little credibility in the eyes of many people.
Thanks, B.S. Lewis. As good as argument as Lewis himself ever made.
And one reason, it feels like almost every week, there's going to be a new pastor, a new musician, a new apologist who just fails to live out the Christian faith. So I
don't really care about this.
Religion so much. Religion was used by secular rulers for accomplishing their own purposes and used religion as a crutch. Or if you really get Christians, follow Christ. And I use the story of the Good Samaritan to kind of make this example. The story of the Good Samaritan obviously is about helping people, but more importantly, it's about who was doing the helping. That the hated minority other, was actually the one who helped when the religious leaders refused to help. This is the story that Christ told to say, go do that. Go follow that example. Don't follow the example of the religious leaders. And so my answer to that is, don't follow Christians, including this one. We all have feet of clay. Follow Christ. And that is why the whole idea of Christian, if you want a religious movement that's full of just perfect people, you're going to search in vain, because none of them are. Well, what about this idea that atheists and materialists can behave in immoral ways? Well, the Bible predicts that. That's not something that surprises anybody. In Romans chapter 2, Paul says that God has put his law on every human heart. And the Christian worldview is everybody, even if they deny it, knows the difference between right and wrong and acts towards the right.
Well, I mean, agree with Barry there that you should follow what's good and not what Christians do. Well, he said follow Christ, but since that's Christ is God and God is the ground of morality, then we're referring to the same thing, even if we don't realize it. So yeah, I think that's a good place to end it. I just will also say, sorry, I'm getting tired. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, the point about the Bible predicting that non-religious people or non-Christians will also act morally. Note that that's blatantly inconsistent with with Barry's entire argument, which is that materialism destroys American culture. So somehow what we have is all of these materialists going around and acting just as morally on average as Christians, because that's what the Bible predicts, and God writes morality in everyone's hearts. And at the same time, we have this idea that if you become materialist, you're likely to go shooting up schools and undermining the legal system and contributing to tribalism in America and so forth. So I don't really know how you can have both of those views at the same time. They seem blatantly in contradiction to me. And the Bible also, especially the New Testament, talks about how all humans are corrupted and that you need to embrace Christ. And when Christ's saving grace is active within you, that you're reborn. You have this second birth, and you become a new person. You're dead to God, and you become alive in Christ. And yet somehow that sort of fails to manifest itself in acting any differently to anyone else. I've asked many Christians about this over the years, and I've never received anything close to a satisfying explanation of how those two ideas can exist consistently with each other. But anyway, that's more of a theological point. Well, so the materialists are suppressing the truth of the morals they know to be true, not acting in the ways that those moral views would dictate they should. Okay, but if that's true, then materialism isn't just destroying American culture. Materialists are just being inconsistent with their material views, but they're still living in accordance with the morality that they're suppressing, at least as much as Christians are. Barry can't simultaneously be saying that materialists, because of their materialism, are destroying American culture, but also that materialists are suppressing their living inconsistently with their materialist views, and therefore not destroying American culture. You can't have it both ways. You can say that they're doing a bit of both, but in to the extent that they're doing one, they're not doing the other, right? And so the ideas are in direct tension with each other. I think this is a fairly simple point. If materialism leads you to do things that are not what God would want, then in that sense, you're saying that materialism is having bad effects. And if that doesn't happen, then materialism is not having those bad effects. They are living in opposition of the Christian views they know to be true. Well, then they are destroying American culture, and they are living in a way that is problematic. But Barry just said that you should expect that non-Christians would live just as morally as Christians would, because the Bible predicts that. I don't understand how you can say that those two views are consistent with each other. They can't be living in opposition to Christianity and consistently with it at the same time. And if you say, well, some people do and some people don't, but then that just gets to the position that on average, it should wash out one way or the other, right? Like there should be an effect. The title of this video is, and what Barry was saying at the start, is that materialism is destroying American culture. And he talked about tribalism, and he talked about the Columbine massacre, and he talked about the what was it? The loss of, what did he say again? Lawlessness in the courts. So I don't understand how you can, he was saying that all of these things are motivated by materialism, but then at the same time, he's trying to say, but materialism doesn't actually motivate people to do bad things or do things differently, because the Bible predicts that they would be just like as other people. You can't say both of those things at the same time. If materialism is motivating people to do bad things, to destroy American culture, then they're not, the materialists are not behaving in the way that people did when no one was a materialist, like when everyone was a Christian. How can you disagree? That's just a logical point. Like if materialism is on the rise and we're going in a bad direction because more and more people are being materialists, it's because materialism has substantive effects on, and negative effects, obviously, on American culture. And in that sense, materialists aren't just like everyone else. They're worse than everyone else. They're doing things that are bad according to God, right? And that's contrary to what Barry just said, that, oh, well, the Bible predicts that the materialists or non-Christians would be more or less just like everyone else in terms of their moral behavior. You just can't have both of those things at once. Anyway, getting Well, I mean, maybe that's a good summary of the video. But irrespective of that specific point, there's the broader point that Barry just completely failed throughout the video to provide any arguments for any of his claims. It was all based on pure assertion and often using complicated terms without defining them. And the only one that we spent any time trying to give a definition for, interestingly, was Christian nationalism, which was the charge that, or at least Sean was concerned not to have levied against Barry. But anyway, I'm quite tired, so I am going to get to bed now. But I know there are a couple of people who've been complaining. I don't do enough streams, so here's a stream. So let's conclude. I don't think materialism is destroying American culture. We may speculate as to what forces or ideologies are contributing to the destruction of American culture, but I don't think it's plausible to say that materialism is a very significant one of them. I mean, even Sean himself said that it's single-digit percentages of the population who are materialists. And then Barry himself also said that non-Christians, according to the Bible, live very similarly to how Christians do. So I think taking those two things together, it's sort of very unclear how materialism is supposed to be destroying anything, even apart from the lack of arguments given and the conflation of things like moral anti-realism and legal positivism with materialism, which are just completely different issues, and not to mention even more outlandish claims like that somehow Nazism or Hitler's views are in any way motivated by materialism, or that New Age views are in any way motivated by or similar to materialism. Just a cacophony of nonsense, really, in this video. One of the worst I've reviewed in a while, I think. So thanks, everyone. Hopefully you found this of interest. Will be well, actually, yeah, there's going to be I don't know if Nathan's talked about this. I don't know if he's still here, but I have an exciting announcement that I'm going to make soon, which connects to Nathan. If he's already announced this, well, so be it. But we haven't firmed up the plans yet. But so, you know, something to look forward to coming up. So I'll leave you on that. Take care of everyone. See you next time. Wait, where's the button?